Chapter 11. Dungeon, Exploring. A giant rat was standing and nibbling on some rotten meat. The creature was in some kind of corridor made of stone. Some torches to the sides were lighting the whole place up. Suddenly the creature perked up. It noticed something in the distance and gave out a high-pitched wail. Mana arrow. The creature couldn't close its mouth in time, as a blue arrow made from energy pierced it. It came out on the other side and connected with the wall before evaporating into the ether. A group of 4 people walked up. In the front was a large muscular woman with brownish skin. She wasn't wearing a lot of protection, but her body looked like a marble statue. She was quite muscular and her abdominal muscles were popping out for others to see. Right next to her was a white-haired girl with pointy wolf ears. She was holding onto 2 long daggers, and as she walked you could see a bushy, white tail following after. She was much shorter than the large person in the front, which made her stick out when the 2 walked side by side. In the back, there was a redhead wearing some brown leather armor and a bow over her shoulder. She had a full quiver of arrows, and was just following after the other 2 girls in the front. Right next to her was the shortest member of the party, a young-looking boy with brown hair and green eyes named Roland. He was getting patted on the shoulder by this bow lady that had a broad grin plastered over her face. Nice, hit there kid, took that rat out in one go. This was the new party that Roland was part of, and today was the first day of their dungeon expedition. This was just the entrance area, so the girls wanted to see what he could do. He decided to use his spell that had the most punching power. It used up more mana than the basic mana bolt spell and needed a longer casting time. But thanks to his mana reserves and high intelligence, this wasn't a problem. His incantation skill was leveling up along with his spells, so they were getting progressively more powerful. It was only a low-level dungeon rat. That thing is weaker than a goblin, nothing to be happy about. Roland shrugged while the group walked. Ha, think he is shy. The 2 talkative girls that were Rebecca and Sahilder laughed at the reply. Raina remained vigilant and walked at the helm of the party. She had the scout class along with the thief class. Roland could have sworn that he saw her sniffing at the air. Is she really a wolf? Maybe just a hunting dog instead? The girl was part of the beast race. This race was divided into various tribes that mostly stayed separated from the other ones. There were various beast races, feline ones, ursanes, and even ones that resembled lizards. Even those had variations in them, like people that were closer in appearance to lions and ones to tigers. Due to the varied appearance that this race had, it was hard for them to get along. It's your first time here, Roland. You might not know this, but this isn't really the dungeon area that adventurers like us explore. Roland looked at the corridor. It was wide to fit in a truck into it. They had been walking through a couple of those, which made him think that it would be one of those maze-like dungeons. This is why his eyes went wide as he saw light coming from afar. When the group walked out, they came out into a wide, open space that looked like a jungle forest. Welcome to the real dungeon. This is the first floor, Becky proclaimed while holding both her hands on her hips. The forest area was truly gigantic. There was even something akin to a sun above them. Roland didn't know what to say. He didn't expect this from what he had read. He only knew that these types of dungeons had floors or levels. He imagined them to be more of a maze of corridors, with slightly larger rooms here and there. But here we had a giant space that probably was a couple of kilometers in width. This is the first level of the Carwin dungeon. It's called the Emerald Wilderness. This is the hunting grounds for the steel-ranked adventurers like us. The levels continue all the way to the 10th. On that level you have to beat the dungeon boss. Though you have to make an appointment with the guild and be lucky enough for no one else to steal it. Steal it? Roland asked while stepping into the first dungeon level. The ground and grass felt normal, like he was stepping onto a real forest, but he could feel that the mana here was a bit peculiar. Yes, the boss takes a whole week to respawn. Some strong adventurer parties or guilds will hog the boss room for resources. Oh, that makes sense, Roland replied, as that would probably be something that he would do. If it was like in games, the bosses probably dropped some rare items or materials. If you could hog those resources for yourself, you could make quite a bit of cash. It was natural for the ones on top to try and hog the resources for themselves. You're quite chatty today, Becky, showing off in front of our little goblin slayer here? The large lady smirked while pushing some bushes to the side as they continued walking. The wolf-like girl was still in the front sniffing at the air. The red-haired girl blushed a bit while glaring in the direction of her party member. Roland just chuckled while walking along with her. Hey, I'm just being a good senior adventurer here. Enemy. While they were talking, Roland heard an unfamiliar voice. It was coming from the front and belonged to the wolf girl party member. It sounded quite cute and high-pitched. It also had a tint of drowsiness to it, making her sound sleepy. So she can talk? Their tracker moved to the side while Sahilder moved to the front. She was holding a rather large 2-handed hammer that probably weighed more than he did. Everyone got into their positions, which consisted of 2 girls in the front and him together with Becky in the back. Some bushes in the front started rustling, and soon enough a monster charged out, going straight for the nearest person. The monster looked like a large boar. It was much larger and more muscular than a regular boar. Its tusks were thicker and longer. It also had bone spikes coming out from its spine. It gave out a ferocious roar while charging at Sahilder. The large woman didn't falter as she grasped her hammer with both hands and managed to block the monster's path. The boar beast smacked into the hilt of the hammer. The girl that was holding it buckled under the weight and slid backward slightly. Her muscles bulged out, and Roland could see her veins popping out as she kept the beast from moving forward. The others weren't passive. While the monster was busy with the party's warrior, a dagger plunged into its side. The moment the monster looked to the person inserting daggers into it, an arrow lodged itself into its eye. The finishing blow was delivered by a giant hammer that shattered the creature's skull into pieces. Its snout released a spray of crimson blood that coated the nearby bushes as the monster died. "You have gained 5 experience points." The voice announced that he had gained some experience. You didn't need to directly kill a monster. If you were in a party, the experience would be distributed among the party members. There was only one limit: the party members couldn't be too far apart in levels or tiers. A Tier 1 person wouldn't get any XP if he was together in a party with a Tier 2 person. This game, like World, apparently had some contingencies against power leveling. Even if someone at Tier 2 or Tier 3 cut off the limbs of the monster and let someone of a lower tier perform the kill, that person wouldn't get any experience. It was as if the system knew how to distinguish between this. This was also why Roland also gained only 5 XP points this time. He didn't really do anything in this battle besides staring at the girls swing their weapons around. Due to this contribution system, people mostly partied up with others at the same tiers. "I guess that I don't even get a turn," Roland said, as the 3 girls quickly took care of the enemy in a matter of seconds. He looked at the dead body with his mana sense, and pointed to a spot at the chest before speaking. "It has a mana stone right there." The girls looked to the young boy, and then to the monster. The wolf girl plunged her dagger into the spot he was pointing at and discovered that it was indeed there. "See, I told you he would be useful. We can save so much time with this." Rebecca cheered while running up to Roland and giving him a hug. He felt some leather armor press into his face, which didn't feel all that nice. The girl also didn't smell all that great. The hygiene in this world was only so. He just grumbled while his face was getting leather burn. He let the girl have her fun. At least he showed that he could be useful in other ways than combat. The mana stone was larger than the one that he found on the goblins. It was more comparable to one that a goblin leader would have. "I guess the monsters here are stronger. Supposedly it has something to do with the mana density in these dungeons." This wasn't the end of their work. The archer and wolf girl pulled out their knives and started working on the monster's remains. Roland just watched with interest. He mostly hunted goblins and the occasional wild boar, so he never really bothered with the bodies that much. These more experienced adventurers started disemboweling the core and taking things like the tusks and the spikes that it had on the back. These tusks and spikes we can sell later. They are used for some armors or alchemy ingredients. The leather can also be used, Becky said while cutting up the defeated beast. She had noticed that the youth was looking at the whole thing with attentiveness. "We're not going to take the meat, are we?" The girl shook her head at the question. "No, this monster meat is quite tough. It would be hard to cook, and it tastes like shit." Roland nodded, as that did make a lot of sense. Who would want to eat something like that? Still, some people ate monster meat. The meat from monsters wasn't toxic or anything, but was mostly hard to prepare due to the stats increasing the muscle density. They remained in one spot. The large lady along with Roland kept watching while the other 2 girls gathered the usable materials. After they were finished, Roland noticed that the wolf girl took out a black-looking bag. It wasn't that large, and this was why he was surprised, as the leather and tusks were shoved inside without a problem. "Ha, first time seeing one? That's a special bag that has a storage magic enchantment on it. You can stuff so much in this bad boy." Rebecca looked quite smug as she looked at the bag. It was one of those spatial storage items that adventurers like to use. This one was painstakingly bought after a year of work by this party. Even after a year, the bag that the girls bought was quite small. The space inside was slightly below 2 cubic meters. "I know about them. They are called spatial bags, or storage bags. Just haven't seen one in a while." He had seen some of these types of bags at the noble house. He didn't have enough time to nab one though. They were always carried around by the servants of higher status. He was lucky enough to steal that class-up stone and didn't want to push his luck. "How much does one like that go for?" "This one? We were lucky and we got it off a retiring adventurer. It was quite a steal for 5 small gold coins. The bigger ones can cost 10 times as much. Even one like this mostly goes from 7 to 10 small gold coins." Roland nodded, as he also wanted to buy himself one of those for the future, but he didn't have nearly enough, and was saving money for the future. The girls managed to get everything done within 10 minutes. Those skillful knife slices must have been the work of high dexterity and some kind of skinning skill. The group moved further into the dungeon. They encountered more of the same-looking boars, and this time around, even Roland was able to chip in. The experience gained while actively participating was much higher. "Source of all magic, heed my call." Let your strength be mine and protect which I deem worthy. Mana shield. A blue mana shield bubble appeared around the party's tank, aiding her in the defensive. The girls were a bit surprised, but the magic managed to stop the rampaging boar monster in its tracks again. The monster fell and Roland received his share of experience along with another mana stone that was embedded in a similar spot as before. The dungeon creatures, sure, have more mana stones than the ones outside. Roland thought while the girls gathered up the loot. Their storage bag had filled up and now some of the leather was sticking out from it. It would be unwise if anyone from them carried in excess of things, so they decided to head back. So ended Roland's first day of partying with the girls. His gains were higher than what he was able to achieve as a solo show, and it was also a lot safer. He didn't need to carry anything on his own, and the frontline fighters protected him if something happened. The only problem that he had with this was that he would have to give up on this way of life sooner or later. He was still aiming for that cushy crafting job in the future, as it was more promising money-wise. I didn't earn that much more than when I was solo hunting the goblins. This was also an uncertain way of earning your living. Sometimes more dangerous monsters could appear, and you could just die like that. He was already lucky to have survived the goblin-infested forest on his own. Those girls don't seem so bad. They at least didn't try to rip the 10-year-old off. They also said that we would go down to the lower floor after I get used to their party dynamic. His new party was smart enough to not push ahead into the unknown with a new untrained party member. The red-haired party leader earned some brownie points with Roland thanks to this decision. They also divided all the money they had gained equally, and he didn't need to help out with the resource gathering process. He also didn't need to carry anything around beside his own gear thanks to the spatial bag that the girls had with them. Well, might as well enjoy this while it lasts. Hope the lower levels won't be too hard. Chapter 12. Hanging out. Roland was looking at some coins on the table. The numbers hovering above them indicated the sum. It was a number above 100, which would put it above one large silver coin. He then looked at Bar Wench snatching that large sum, leaving 3 large pitchers of unidentified booze behind. There were already some bottles spread out that were open and half empty. "What are you looking at, Roland? Drink up," Sahilder shouted out, while she herself grabbed one of the large pitchers and started drinking directly from it. Roland wasn't sure what kind of alcohol was in there, but it was dripping down this muscular woman's mouth and right onto the table. He had been doing business with the girls for a couple of weeks now, and they were having a little party at the local tavern. He had apparently gotten through the trial period, and they now wanted to go deeper into the dungeon with him. "You sure you should be bringing a minor here?" Roland narrowed his eyes at the 3 girls. Even though he was an older gentleman on the inside, on the outside he was a 10-year-old. His party members thought that he was slightly older, and apparently in this world, after you obtained your first class, you were considered an adult. There was no such thing as an age cutoff for drinking, so they didn't see anything wrong with this situation. "Minor? What's that? Have some good liquor?" Rebecca asked while pouring herself a tall glass of the alcoholic beverage, then chugging down on it. Roland was amazed at how well these 2 girls were handling their alcohol. Even if he thought back to his old college days, he couldn't recall anyone being this much of a binge drinker as these 2. "I guess no one cares as long as they have the money for it," he grumbled under his nose, mostly saddened by the fact that he got peer pressured into chipping in. He lost a whole 20 large copper coins that were worth close to 4 goblins. He suddenly felt someone's hand on his shoulder, and spotted the third-party member looking at him. It was Raina, the wolf girl. Her face was all red, and her wolf ears were twitching all over the place. She had an uncharacteristic shit-eating grin plastered all over her face. Leon, what a dotine, drink with bingshies." She was already quite drunk, and pushing a glass of booze against his face. The moment he got a whiff of it he almost gagged. "How can these people drink this?" He started pushing the white wolf girl away with both his hands, but the stat difference started getting apparent as she didn't budge from her spot. "You sure are chatty today." He bobbed and weaved while trying to evade the smelly cup of alcohol. The wolf girl was quite persistent with her assaults. The other 2 just watched and laughed from the side. "This is a rite of passage. Drink up, who?" She jabbed her finger into Roland's side, which made him open up his mouth. The wolf girl's eyes shone in a golden hue as she skillfully deposited the beverage into his gullet. At least that's how it looked like from her perspective. In reality, she just splashed the whole thing onto the young boy's face. Roland closed his eyes and spit most of the alcohol out, but some made its way down his throat. It had a familiar cheap taste, and also he could feel it burning his throat. "Bah, this is badly distilled booze." He was a drinker as any college student, but after one night of heavy drinking, he had sworn never to drink again. He had a criminally weak stomach, and had to suffer each day after such events, so he had decided to just stop. Sahilder and Rebecca decided to join in on the fun. They held him tightly and forced more alcohol down his mouth. The 2 watched the liquid slide down one of the bottles as the boy chugged. "Hick, drink up, boy. Men have to be able to hold their liquor." Hick, basic alcohol resistance gained. The rest of the night was a blur. He remembered vomiting quite a bit while dancing with his shirt off on the tavern table, Some other people were cheering him on while shouting out his Goblin Slayer nickname. He woke up on the other day in an unfamiliar room at some inn. He was with the rest of his party members that were passed out. His head was killing him along with his back as he spent the night face down on the hard wooden floor while the girls were sharing one bed together. Oof my head, Erp. He held his hand over his mouth and bolted out of the room. He managed to run outside the inn door, and then instantly vomited again. The people just gave him some side glances, as this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I need to get out of this city before those 3 idiots kill me. He wiped his mouth with his forearm and dragged his body back into the inn. This one wasn't the one that he was using, so he concluded that his female party members must have dragged him here. He couldn't recall much from what happened last night. He got drunk rather fast, and it didn't take long for him to lose it. Guess I have a weak stomach in this new body too. He returned to the room that his 3 friends were. He was greeted to a funny sight of the 2 smaller girls sprawled out under the taller girl. Her feet were placed on the faces of Rebecca and Raina. She herself had her head dropped down at the edge of the bed that was too short to contain her whole height. He had a vacant expression on his face while looking at his 3 smelly party members. Man, they are even snoring. Roland didn't drink all that much and passed out fast. His party members continued drinking into the night. This was why they were still passed out, while he himself was already on his feet. Roland's image of how girls were cute and beautiful creatures was shattered this day. The smell in this room was also something to remember. He grabbed his clothes and removed himself from the room. He needed to drink some water. There were also special potions to alleviate hangovers. He was just too stingy to buy it, and would rather use the money for something else. He returned to his own inn and flopped on his bed, still hungover. He had noticed that he had gained alcohol resistance, which made him think that he could probably get some other resistances in a similar way. Do I really want to eat poison to get more resistance? The first thought was to eat some mild poison and get that. Having poison resistance could prove quite handy, but he wasn't in a safe enough place to test this out. He also would need to spend some cash on poison cures if he ever attempted it. He tried resting after drinking some water, but his stomach was still rumbling. He and the girls were supposed to head into the lower floors of the dungeon this day, but from his standpoint, that would have to wait till the next day. To his surprise, he heard a knock on his door followed by the voice of the party leader, Becky. Hey Roland, why didn't you come to the Adventurers Guild? We were supposed to meet up half an hour ago. The girl burst into the room looking just fine. She didn't look like someone that had drunk herself to sleep the night before. They were going to meet up, but he had thought that the small expedition would be put on hold. The girls had other plans apparently. After getting forced to get into his armor and robe, he was yoinked outside and carried over like a sack of potatoes to the dungeon entrance by Sahilder. He theorized that the 3 females had built up alcohol resistance over the years and made a full recovery the next day. You need to learn how to hold your liquor, Roland. Don't worry, Big Sis will teach you. Sahilder smacked her chest with gusto while grinning at the smaller boy. Roland just shook his head side to side before grasping it with his hand as he still had a mild headache. I'd rather not tell. Let's just get this over with. Don't worry, you'll sweat it out in no time. Rebecca smacked Roland's back while they headed inside the dungeon. The boy almost keeled over from the force behind it. The long corridor was infested with some rats that were quickly dispatched, or they'd just run away. Inside the first level, they followed a route that they had been taking for the past week. It was very rare to encounter more than 1 monster at a time on this level, and the large boar monster was the only type that roamed this jungle forest. Mana arrow. An arrow of mana flew and collided with the monster boar's side. It lodged itself into the flesh and caused the beast to wail in pain. Even though his aim was a bit off, the creature didn't pose any threat to them, and they defeated it in a matter of moments. Feeling good about themselves, the group headed down to the 2nd floor entrance. They were greeted by a large gate and stairs leading down. The stairs were 5 meters in width, and everyone could walk side by side. Want to hear something interesting, Roland? He just nodded at the redhead leader while they walked down. He was starting to feel slightly better after moving now. For some reason, the monsters can't enter these stairs that separate the levels. If you ever need to run, be sure to head for the stairs and wait for us. The youth nodded while looking at the corridor. Torches lit up the area to the next level. Roland was wondering if they were magical in nature, as he didn't think anyone replaced them. They didn't meet any other adventurer party on the way to the 2nd level, and it wasn't any different than the 1st floor, as it was also a forest area. This floor is similar to the 1st, but the probability of more monsters appearing together is higher. While talking, Roland noticed that Raina raised her hand. The party stopped and pulled out their weapons while waiting. The girl sniffed at the air, and then pointed to a nearby tree. 2, one there, and 1 over there, she said in a monotone voice while Rebecca nodded. She turned to Roland and while pointing to the left side, he nodded and started chanting his magic bolt spell at the enemy that was on the right. He tried pinpointing the position of the monster, as he could see something green and slimy wiggling on the branch he was looking at. Mana bolt. The ball of condensed mana flew at the enemy and exploded after meeting its target. Roland saw the thing that he was aiming at exploding into chunks. The creature on the left side suffered a similar fate by receiving an arrow to the face. The two monsters slipped from the branches, and Roland could finally see what they were. Big spiky caterpillars? He looked at the corpse while using his identification skill. It gave him the creature's name, that was Needleworm. The large caterpillar-looking monster was filled with spikes, and the mouth part had some nice chompers. The blood that these creatures had was apparently green, and the smell was also very interesting. Good going, those buggers like to hide and then throw themselves at you with their spiky heads. They also smell like Sahilder's armpits. Rebecca chuckled while looking at her party member that shook her large fist at her from the side. My armpits do not smell. She narrowed her eyes at Becky and gave her pits a good whiff. She grimaced and looked back at the red-haired girl that was grinning from the side with, "And I told you so" look. The girls spread out and went material, gathering as everyone got back to work. These bugs were apparently one-trick ponies and could only fling themselves at you head first. Roland pointed out that one of them had a mana stone while thinking. This type of monster could prove troublesome if it managed to attack while they were busy with one of those boar types. I guess this isn't a lower floor for nothing. He glanced at the bugs again. They weren't very resilient and could probably be taken out with a short sword. Problem was that they were leaf green and blended with the forest, which made them troublesome to spot. He glanced at the wolf girl and realized the importance of someone who could spot the monsters before the battle started. A scout might be even more important in the party than a mage. What good is firepower if you get shanked in the back? This mana stone is tiny, Roland thought while looking at the wolf girl pocket the small mana stone into the spatial bag. The expedition continued. Thanks to Reyna, that proved to be the MVP of this dungeon run, they managed to slay every monster with low to moderate difficulty. There were too many of those needleworms in one spot, they would just evade them. The party roamed around the second floor for a while, before their spatial bag got filled up with monster materials and herbs. They were standing at the entrance of the third floor, the girls wondering if they should proceed. If we had another spatial bag, we could visit the next floor, but we are already full. Those monster spikes don't even sell that well. The large muscular lady pouted while holding her large hammer over her shoulder. Ha, you probably just want to test out that hammer of yours on the wereboars, don't you? Rebecca said while narrowing her eyes at Sahilder. New hammer? Wereboars. Roland looked at Sahilder's hammer. He did notice that it was different than the last one, but didn't she already swing it against some of the regular boars? Yes, look at this baby, it has runic enchantments. I spent my monthly savings on this. The large lady hugged her battle hammer like she would a lover, and even gave the square hammer part a large smooch. Roland cringed a bit at the display of affection before asking. Oh, it has a runic enchantment. I read that those let you perform some spells. The girls looked at their young companion. The boy's eyes looked a bit wider, and he looked interested in the weapon as he was inching forward. The large lady didn't mind and presented the large weapon towards the youth. He noticed that the metallic hammer part did have some strange symbol engraved into it. It has a lesser impact rune. I bet I can make a wereboar's head explode with it. See, Roland understands how badass this baby is. Rebecca rolled her eyes at the display while watching Roland touching the part where the rune was engraved. The boy's gaze seemed vacant, as if he was really enamored with the weapon, just like his warrior companion. This wasn't the case though. Roland felt like something was drawing him in. His eyes shone momentarily, and he could feel a strange attraction to the strange-looking magic symbol. He could see some glowing lines appearing out of nowhere, and going in various directions. These glowing lines of light went through the entire rune, and they looked familiar. Before he could examine it any further, though, the wolf girl called out that some monsters appeared. Roland felt like he was close to discovering something important. This would have to wait though, as his life was more important. The monsters that appeared weren't anything new, just two of the same spiky boar variant. I don't think that meathead will lend me that weapon to investigate. Maybe I need to start saving up. The battle soon ensued. Roland's mind was preoccupied with the future though. He was close to reaching his cap, and then he would need to decide on his next class. Chapter 13. Forgotten Problems. More time had passed. Roland felt like his adventure was slowly coming to an end, as after about half a year he had hit his level cap. Their adventurer party had ventured to the third floor of the dungeon. They decided on not moving past this level, as the monster attacks began to be more vicious and troublesome. The monster types increased, and with those the defensive tactics had to be changed. They couldn't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. The strongest monsters around that level were the wereboars. They were creatures with gorilla-like bodies and the head of a boar. Roland also finally saw Sahilder's large magical hammer at work. The rune was activated by her mana, and when she connected with the target, a small explosion would occur. If she timed it well, it was able to take out a wereboar in one hit, or at least incapacitate it. Problem was that it required a lot of mana that a warrior class didn't have much of. I guess a weapon like that is situational, have to make it count, unless you have enough mana to spam it constantly. Roland was sitting in the room that he had rented while thinking to himself. The candlelight danced around while the youth was looking at a piece of paper. He had a quill in his hand, and he dipped it into some ink. His digits moved smoothly as he started writing on the parchment. The words came out clear, and the penmanship was satisfactory. Basic calligraphy L9 reached. He heard the familiar voice of the system, and he gave out a sigh. He almost threw his quill to the side. His fingers were a bit cramped up from the hours of writing he forced himself to do. Finally, this took way too long. He looked at the stack of papers on his table. There were no comfy cushioned chairs here. The light was dim, and the room was windy and cold. He had spent months writing down characters over and over again before going to sleep, just to get this darn calligraphy skill up to level 9, as it was the requirement for the new class. Ugh, I'm afraid that this will be how my life looks from now on. He closed his eyes and rubbed the space between the eyebrows and his nose that was called the glabella. He looked up to the ceiling and watched the shadows dance around, while the candlelight was pushed around by the wind in his room. I'll have to tell them sooner or later, he thought to his party of misfits. He had spent some quality time with those 3 girls, and they were slowly growing on him. He knew that his stay in this city would be temporary, and he needed to move on. Place to train his crafting classes wasn't here. He wouldn't be able to sell his spell scrolls here that well either. He did his research, and no one would buy anything from a no-name like him. He needed to attach himself to some well-established company. Plus you needed to actually pay for a permit to sell, which cost quite the penny. I wonder if they will force me to sign a contract or something. Could always try peddling at the market. Not. He shook his head, while imagining sitting on a rug and trying to sell some mana arrow spell scrolls for the whole day. He placed his coin sack on the table and let the system count the coins. Not nearly enough. He started out well. He was making enough coin to even save up. Later on, the repairing costs came biting him back with a vengeance. His short sword didn't last past the 5th month, and his leather armor was already broken in a couple of places. He had to replace his boots and other various things. Adventuring as a bronze or steel grade adventurer wasn't a high-paying job. From what he had gathered, he wouldn't really start earning more until he became a silver rank. At that rank, the better paying jobs opened up. The requirement was having a tier 2 class, though, so that was still a long way off. Bronze and steel is for tier 1 classes, silver and gold for tier 2. From platinum start the tier 3 classes. Adventurers mostly ended up at the silver rank. If you managed to get yourself into gold, you were considered slightly above average. Anything past platinum was considered the elite and veterans. The number of adventurers at the highest class could apparently be counted on one hand. Those were the true titans of the industry. Even countries or empires would have to bow their head to individuals at that level. Adamantium, huh? Do you need to be tier 4 or 5 for that? I should probably forget about that. Roland had slowly steeled his heart about becoming a craftsman. He had fun with his new party, and fighting monsters was less boring than writing scrolls, but it was also a lot more dangerous. He didn't delude himself into thinking that he could come out in one piece every time. He could see adventurers dying in various ways. This was a serious and dangerous profession. Becoming a smith, earning some coin, and then finding a nice voluptuous wife sounds like the plan for me. You don't earn as much experience as a crafting class while fighting monsters either. Roland rubbed his chin while looking at his stats. Name, role, Ardent Mage, L25, P300, 28, 328, and P1483, 1483, Sp 419, 419 Strength, 25 Agility, 28 Dexterity, 40 Vitality, 25 Endurance, 26 Intelligence, 80 Willpower, 57 Charisma, 12 Luck. 6 My mana stat is still stupidly high. I guess I'll be able to create a lot of spell scrolls a day. Read that the more mana you infuse into the writing, the stronger the spell will be. First I need to change my class though. Still think I should buy an item with a rune. He asked Sahilder about lending him that large hammer of hers. The woman didn't want to give it up, saying that she would only lend it to him if he beat her in arm wrestling or in drinking. He gave up after the first try. He had no way of winning in either situation, so he didn't even try. He knew that the woman was only teasing him and would probably give it up if he asked enough. He looked at some more runes afterward, but he needed more time to experiment. He decided to get an item for himself, one that he could disassemble. This wasn't something he could investigate in a short span of time. He bothered the girls about helping him find the cheapest item with a runic enchantment. For some reason, he didn't get the same feeling when glancing on items that didn't have runic enchantments, but instead the regular ones. The normal ones were cheaper, but were considered weaker. They also covered more surface area on the items, so you couldn't place as many of them on one. He was hesitating as he didn't want to just blow his heart, earn cash on a useless item. His curiosity was piqued though. He needed to examine a runic object. He had just enough to get a knife with a lesser rune of sharpness. It was an item that would be the most useful of the ones he could afford. He nodded to himself while thinking about his adventurer work. I shouldn't go to the dungeon before changing my class. I'll lose out on a big chunk of my experience. Just like before the ascension ritual, his experience would somewhat be saved over, but only to a certain point. In the long run, it would be a big loss in experience points, so he needed to change his class fast. I'll go to that log cabin in the morning, then buy that knife. Roland blew out his candle and went to sleep. The next day, he got up early morning and was sure to eat breakfast before going out. He got used to the gruel that was served here. The bar lady even started improving on her recipe. The older lady gave him a wink after he finished up eating, and even offered him some free water to wash it down with. Heading out early in the morning, boy? Roland looked at the woman. Her name was Hilda, and the bartender that was her husband was named Boris. He had been living in this inn for close to half a year now and knew them well. He managed to haggle the price down a bit. People that stayed longer and paid monthly were graciously allowed a 5% discount. Something like that. Have to visit the West Woods for something. I'll probably be back in a couple of hours. The lady nodded while cleaning up. He didn't waste any more time as he headed out. He passed by the gate guards that knew him well by this point. The two gave him a nod while he was passing by. He looked at some carriages that were lined up at the entrance and walked past them. His next destination was the log cabin in the woods. Unbeknownst to him, a certain person was watching. The figure walked past the gate guards and watched from afar as the boy disappeared into the distance. The person clenched his fist while looking down to the ground, as if he was deliberating on something. He soon left not long after. Should I run there? My running skills leveled up past the basic ones. He deliberated, but felt kind of lazy, so he decided on walking instead. He would get there within an hour, so it wasn't that bad. His basic skills were now able to level up to the regular versions. He even received a free stat point here and there after they evolved. Skills like basic sneaking would raise his agility, while basic swordsmanship his strength. He hadn't been on this path in a while, but thanks to his high intelligence stat his memory was great. He remembered to follow the dirt road, and even recalled that day, while he was sitting in that carriage. "Ha, I thought that guy wanted to murder me at that time." He laughed to himself while moving forward. When he arrived he was greeted by the same log cabin. It looked even worse than he remembered. There was clearly no one taking care of it. "Man, why would you leave a kid here alone?" He crossed his arms over one another, while thinking back to his family days. He wondered if they even remembered that he was living here. He didn't think that his siblings would care much about him. They avoided each other like the plague back in the day. He was glad that they all left after attaining their classes, and only came back sporadically to the mansion. What was his plan anyway? Well, I should probably get my things and get back. No use staying here. He didn't leave anything inside of the log cabin, as he had carried everything over to the inn within the first couple of days of him moving. He entered the wooden house. The wooden door creaked open. "I'm sure there was one here. Ah, there it is." He grabbed a rusted shovel. It was in the same place that he had left it. This place looked abandoned. Didn't look like even bandits would ransack it. There were just old rusty pots and pans left here. The dust had piled up and made Roland think that no one besides him had visited this place in a long time. He glanced at the cabin one last time, before leaving and heading into the woods to get to his hiding place. It didn't take him long to find the tree he hid it next to. Doesn't look like anyone did any digging. I guess it was the right thing to do. He hesitated about taking the class change stones sooner. They were quite costly at 2 small gold coins a pop. This was the price of more than a monthly income of a whole commoner household. Most people were only able to earn 1 small gold coin per month. Of course, if you were a high-level adventurer, a merchant, or a noble, then it wasn't such a big price to pay. I'm lucky that I swiped it. I wouldn't be able to class up this soon otherwise. I have barely half of that saved up. Roland smirked while finally managing to dig up the blue quartz-looking crystal that was used for changing your class. He held it for a moment before placing it into his pocket. He was done here. He placed the rusty shovel over his shoulder while intending to bring it back before heading out. He strolled through the forest and kind of underestimated the sheer amount of branches in the way. His shovel got stuck on some of the trees, and he came to an abrupt stop. This was the thing that saved his life. The same moment he heard something flying in front of his face and embedding itself into the nearby tree. He looked at the item that flew and discovered it to be a throwing knife. It was still wiggling back and forth on the tree trunk. What the? He quickly became alert and ducked behind another tree. He could hear some rustling in the distance. Someone was there, and he was trying to hurt him, probably even kill him. He gulped hard while tossing the shovel away to the side. He had come with this adventurer gear. He grasped his short sword, but didn't pull it out from the scabbard just yet. Was it a goblin? I don't remember them sneaking up on people like this. It wasn't strange for goblins to use throwing weapons. The strange part was that there was no high-pitched scream following the knife throw. A regular goblin would charge in right afterward, and not hide. It might even be some kind of evolved variant. I should probably escape. Don't know what I'm dealing with. He looked up to the trees. He deliberated climbing it, but then gave up on the idea. That was a good tactic for waiting and hiding, but not really if he wanted to escape. He dropped down and started slowly sneaking away. His basic sneaking skill had leveled up, so he was now much harder to spot. His steps shuffled around without making much noise. The only problem was that he couldn't go back the same way that he had come from. His enemy looked to be coming from the direction of the cabin. He might have been followed here. I need to get back into the city, aw shit. While thinking, he stepped onto a small branch that made a snapping sound. The moment the sound occurred, he could hear some rustling behind him. Whatever was there had started running towards his position. Fuck it. He stood up and started running with all his might. His smaller stature allowed him to slip between the branches and the bushes, but in his slightly panicked state, he was getting scratched up. He couldn't see his opponent, but by the sound of his or her steps, he could tell that it was someone heavier and bigger than he was. Who is it? Is it really a bandit or a robber? He wanted to look back and see, but he was worried that if he did that the person would catch up to him. He continued running, heading towards the main road. He wasn't that far away from the city. Maybe if he made it far enough, this band, it would abandon his robbery attempt. He continued running, but he could tell that the person behind him was coming closer. Even though he had trained his sprinting skill and running past the basic ones, the person behind him was much faster. In no time he felt someone's gaze on his neck. He dodged to the side as another throwing knife flew past him. It grazed his shoulder and managed to cut open his leather armor slightly. Roland tumbled to the side. His opponent was finally revealed. The man was taller than him, at about 183 cm of height or close to 6 feet tall. He was wearing the usual black hood to cover his face. In one hand he had another throwing knife. To the side he had some kind of long, thin, bladed weapon. On further examination, it turned out to be a heavy rapier. What do you want? I don't have any money. Roland left most of his cash at the inn. It was safe enough to stash it there. He was only carrying some pocket change and the class-changing crystal. Did he see me dig it up and now he wants the crystal? How did he know that I was even here? The man moved in closer while finally speaking up, his hand still gripping the throwing knife, while ready to throw it. Who said I wanted your money? Like a little bastard son like you even has anything I want. Roland became confused. If this wasn't a robbery, then what was it? Then he realized something strange about how the man referred to him. Bastard son? Wait, did the Baron send you? Why would he want to kill me now of all things? Roland asked while backing away and keeping to the trees. Luckily those made it hard for him to get hit by those knives. Heh, I guess you aren't that dumb like you look. It doesn't matter though, I have enough of staying in this forsaken town. The man finally removed his hood and revealed his face. This was someone that Roland was familiar with. This was someone that after being here for half a year he had forgotten. It was the man that he saw keeping tabs on him before. For some reason he was now trying to kill him. Chapter 14. Problem Resolving. The two looked at each other. On one side stood a boy that wasn't even 11 years old. On the other side was a tall man with long chestnut brown hair. He had a bushy beard that didn't look like it was trimmed in months. His eyes were bloodshot, as if he didn't get a good night's rest in quite some time. Wait, you're the one that the Baron sent to keep watch over me. He didn't order you to kill me, did he? The man furrowed his brows at what Roland had said. He straightened out a bit, while snorting, the throwing knife dancing between his fingers. So you knew? It doesn't matter. No one has to know. There are a lot of dangerous beasts in this forest. Roland kept backing away while the man continued to approach. He was clearly going against his initial orders, and wanted to kill him for some unknown reason. Are you sane? Do you really want to kill a noble son? Even if I'm a bastard, I'm still a noble. You will hang for this. There was a clear rule against killing nobles. If a commoner attempted such things, they would be imprisoned and maybe even killed, even if the noble was guilty of a crime. The nobles liked to keep to themselves and didn't like it if other people took the law into their own hands. Shut it, you bastard. Do you know how long I've been here? So much time spent just watching some ignorant brat. You were supposed to go crawling back within the week. Why do I have to babysit a little bastard like you? If you're dead, I can finally go back. I'll never become a knight if I stay in a shithole like this. Roland's eyes widened as he finally understood what this was all about. The man was hired by his father. He was probably a soldier from the army. He was ordered to keep an eye on Roland, probably to protect him if something happened. The problem was that no one expected the 10-year-old boy to last this long. He had no problems living in this town now. From this man's point of view, the short temporary job became a full-time thing. That doesn't have anything to do with me. You can just quit. They could just hire someone else. Roland looked around while he was trying to find a good route of escape, but the man was much faster, so that was a big problem. Look at this little shit. You think I can just refuse a direct order from the commander? If I return without a good reason, he will just send me right back or kick me out. On the other hand, if there is no reason for me to remain here anymore. The man grinned while licking his throwing knife. There was one thing that didn't make sense for Roland in that statement. Why was he not afraid of getting made an example of if he let his target die? Wait, won't you get punished if I die? Weren't you hired to protect me? The man just laughed while moving closer. Protect you? Do you really think that man cares for you that much? No, I'm just here to keep them informed about your whereabouts. They never told me to protect you in any way. If you die well, some people would even be glad. But I've already said too much. Apparently his dear old dad didn't think he really needed any protection. This guy was only here to keep tabs on him, and to exchange information. The big problem here was that this man had some high aspirations. He wanted to become a knight. This wasn't an easy endeavor though. You needed to achieve a lot of military merit for that, but instead, he was stuck here not really doing anything worthwhile. The last sentence that the man muttered echoed in his mind. Did someone coax this man to do this? He made it sound like he knew who that person was. Maybe the man didn't go crazy after spending half a year in this small town. Maybe there was more to this than meets the eye. It was also strange that the man wasn't afraid of hurting a noble son. Maybe he had someone backing him. Why anyone would want him dead was quite a surprise. He didn't think he had enough worth for someone to go out of his way for something like this. You have taken 8 damage. Roland moved his head to the side as the man threw his throwing knife. It grazed his cheek while slicing his flesh apart. The man charged forward, his hand going for his rapier. The pointy weapon's tip shone in orange light as he plunged it forward. Luckily for Roland, there were many trees to duck behind. The moment the tip of the heavy rapier was inserted into the tree, the area around the weapon's tip exploded. Splinters of wood shoot out into all directions while the man continued with his assault. Roland could only duck down and run, hiding behind large trees in hopes of getting away. Dodging skill level 2 reached. Got him it, not now. One level in dodging wouldn't aid him too much, and the sound of the system announcer was just distracting. He was sure that there was no reasoning with this person anymore. His only way out was to escape. He didn't have enough time to chant a spell as the man would use this chance to throw a knife at him or stab him with that enchanted weapon of his. It didn't look good for him at all. He wasn't even sure where he was going anymore. He was busy with dodging everything. Thanks to his smaller build and nimbleness, he was able to survive for now. But it was mostly thanks to the trees covering his escape. That is when the problem arose, as he found himself in a clearing with no trees around, and only green grass. He bolted to the side, trying to get back into the forest and away from the wide open space, but before he could, he felt a sharp pain in his leg. He tumbled to the ground, while groaning. A throwing knife stuck in his calf. You have taken 31 damage. Finally got you. Know where to run now, you little runt. The man apparently had more of those throwing knives hidden in his robe. Roland looked at his leg and quickly yanked the blade out. The pain was intense, but he was pumped so full of adrenaline that he could power through it. He tried standing up and running again, but instead he limped forward. He was now unable to make any reasonable space between himself and his enemy. In a last-ditch effort, he decided to pull out his short sword. While turning around, he got into his fighting stance and faced his opponent. Well, at least you have some backbone, kid. The man approached while grinning. His teeth shone off as he approached. Roland wasn't idle. He tried backing off while chanting a mana arrow spell, his own short sword raised in an attempt to block any incoming attacks. The man was too fast though. He took a regular fencing stance and quickly plunged his sword forward. Before Roland could even react to defend himself with his sword, he felt a sharp pain in his right shoulder. The man jumped back after his attack went through, blood leaking from the tip. Phil fizzled out even before the youth could utter more than one word. You have taken 46 damage. You think a tier 1 can win against a tier 2? You never stood a chance, brat. We live in different worlds. Roland was baffled by the display of speed. He wasn't able to react at all. He had thought that he was strong for a tier 1, never really having troubles against the goblins or the dungeon monsters all that much. Even though he was a mage, he at least thought that he could somewhat defend himself. Apparently, he was wrong in that claim. There was a big difference between tier 1 and tier 2, mostly due to the fact that a tier 2 class received a multiplier to their stats. The moment they managed to get through the class up, a 1.5 times multiplier would be added to all of their stats. They would go through a qualitative change that would increase their power by a big margin compared to the lower tier 1 classes. I don't think you can get away with this. Someone will find out the truth. The man stopped while pointing his rapier at the boy. The truth? You overestimate your worth, brat. No one cares about you, and those 3 adventurer girls, you'll take care of them soon enough, hee. Adventurers get wiped out by monsters all the time. The man was really chatty. He had spent a lot of time in seclusion, and without anyone to talk to. He just had to reveal his big plan like a villain of the week. As always, such behavior proved to be the downfall of most of those types. The moment he ended his sentence, and was about to plunge his rapier into the boy's chest, he noticed something. He jumped back while an arrow whizzed past his eyes. Then, from another angle, a dagger came flying, aiming at the spot where the man had dodged the initial arrow. The man bent his body at an awkward angle and managed to stop his momentum, and evaded this one as well. He propelled himself backward while turning, his eyes going to the spots that these 2 attacks came from. Who is there? It didn't take long for a small group of girls to appear. It was Roland's adventurer party that had came to his rescue. The first one to appear was the large muscular tank of the group. She charged at the rapier-wielding man while holding onto her great hammer, ready to split his head. Slightly behind her was the wolf girl. She was half a step behind her party member, one dagger in her hand, while the one that she threw was picked up along the way. "Roland, are you okay?" Rebecca was the last one to arrive. She ran up to where Roland was limping along. Blood was coming from his shoulder and leg wound. "How did you know I was here?" "Never mind, be careful, that man is a tier 2, probably some kind of fencer class." Roland shouted out so that Reina and Sahilder could hear him. He was worried that they would get themselves killed against someone with superior stats. "I'll explain later, let's take care of this guy first. Can you fight?" Roland nodded at Rebecca while limping a bit. He grabbed a recovery potion from the side and drank it fully. The rest was poured directly on the wounds. He cringed from the pain. His wounds sizzled slightly and started closing up. Potions were slow working, and it would take some time for him to recover. His P was now slowly going up while the potion did its thing. "Why, yes, just let me chant my spell." Rebecca nodded before knocking another arrow into her bow and firing it off at the man. Sahilder was about to get herself stabbed in the neck, but luckily, the arrow forced the enemy back. "Damn, what are you three doing here? Why would you be here of all places?" The man's face contorted in a malicious way as he glared at the two frontline fighters that were circling around him. The large woman tried hitting him with the big hammer while swinging wide. Every time he tried countering due to Sahilder over-swinging, the wolf girl was there to pounce from a blind spot, making the man dodge away. With the addition of Rebecca's arrows, the man was now having a difficult time. "Us three, do we know this guy?" Sahilder asked while glaring. "I'll explain it later, just focus on the fight, be careful." Roland shouted out from the back, Rebecca next to him, as she was a bit apprehensive about leaving him alone. "Even if it's 3, a tier 1 is still a tier 1. The man raised his rapier up while standing straight. Sahilder and Reina moved in, the larger one moving from the front, while the smaller attempted a backstab. Suddenly the man's feet started glowing in a green light. Before any of the two could deliver a blow, his whole body blurred. Gale step. The two hit nothing but air while the man used some kind of movement skill. His movements became hard to read and his speed increased tremendously. He appeared behind the wolf girl that had tried stabbing him in the back. From his point of view, someone like her was the first one that needed to go. "Die." He plunged his saber forward, aiming directly at her heart. The tip of his thrusting sword's tip glowed in an orange light, while on a collision course with the girl's chest. Reina could only slightly turn around in an attempt to parry with her dagger, but she was far too slow to react in time. Before the attack could fully go through, though, a semi-transparent bubble of mana appeared around the wolf girl's body, and it took the brunt of the attack. "Mana shield," Roland shouted out while trying not to mess up his magic chant. He poured more mana than usual into the shield to make it extra hard to penetrate. Even with that, it wasn't able to fully negate the fencer's attack. His thrusting sword bent slightly, but then nonetheless managed to pierce through the magic shield. Thankfully, this was enough time for Reina to react. She parried the thrust, making it move slightly sideways while she herself jumped to the other side. In the end, she still ended up with a bloodied, grazing wound to her shoulder. Sahilder was quick to aid her comrade in arms, and tried to use her hammer on the fast enemy. Unfortunately, her slow swings were proving to be ineffective against someone much faster than herself. Luckily, she wasn't alone in her struggle. Even though injured, Reina threw her dagger forward. The man dodged like last time, but had to activate his skill yet again, just to get out of there. Blasted winches. Even though the fencer hadn't received a hit yet, he was looking pale. Physical classes use stamina, along with mana, to activate their class skills. This meant that if they weren't careful, they would tire easily. Tier 2 physical classes were able to use some powerful active skills, but the cost to their stamina was high. This was also why the fencer was slowly getting tired, losing his speed that was his biggest advantage in this fight. Mana arrow. A shining blue arrow of mana flew directly towards the man's face, and as he was dodging it, a regular arrow approached him from another angle. He activated his skill once more while dodging this double-ranged assault, but only to be greeted by a shoulder tackle from the side by the large muscular lady tank of the group. "Not so fast anymore, huh? You are pretty weak for a tier 2, probably just went through your advancement." Sahilder snorted at the enemy, who had misused his skills. Normally, a seasoned tier 2 warrior should be able to defeat tier 1 classes. The problem was that the three young women were already well into their second, tier 1 classes. They were also used to fighting with each other in a group, so they knew how to cover each other's weaknesses. With the addition of a mage that could spam his spells for quite some time, he had met his match. The man had used up most of his mana while using his enchanted weapon, combined with no more stamina, and he was on the defensive. Mana arrow. Mana bolt. Roland had mana to spare, so he continued to cast his attack spells at this enemy. Rebecca, that was next to him, kept shooting till all of her arrows were gone. Two girls on the front line continued fighting while making sure not to let the dangerous close-range fighter approach their party members. The tide of the battle had turned. One of Roland's mana arrows finally managed to lodge itself into the man's thigh, taking away his biggest strength, which was his agility. He started cursing at the party of three girls and the boy. He was apprehensive about this loss and unwilling to accept it. In the moment of weakness, he finally fell to the large hammer that descended on his head. The strike combined with the impact rune caused the man's head to explode into many tiny chunks. The party could finally sigh out in relief as they had managed to bring down this tier 2 fencer. They had suffered some injuries here and there, but besides Roland's the wounds weren't that bad. You have gained 479 experience. Finally the bastard is dead. I need a drink, the large lady proclaimed while having trouble holding her large weapon. She along with Reina had used up all of their stamina in this fight, but it was worth it in the end. Rebecca was sure to help patch up her party members. The low-grade healing potions weren't all that great, so some required bandaging. Hey Roland, what was that all about? That guy seemed to know us, Rebecca asked while they all gathered over by the man's dead body. Reina was looking at it with a vacant expression and poking it with her foot, but she soon turned to face the boy, probably also curious about the man's real identity. Roland just gave out a sigh while limping some. He sat down on the grass before speaking out. I think I should probably tell you the truth. The thing is, Chapter 15. Loot and Research. The man that was supposed to be keeping his family informed about Roland was now dead. His cold body was lying motionless on the green grass that was now tainted with his blood and chunks of meat. Sahilder, his party member, had landed a devastating blow to the man's cranium, making it splatter everywhere like a ripe watermelon. Hardy was now reorganizing. Wounds were being bandaged, and the man's belongings were being examined while Roland explained his identity. So, should we call you Sir Roland from now on? Roland furrowed his eyebrows at the remark that Rebecca gave him. He had explained most of it. That he was a bastard son of a baron, and that he was here to make some money and make it on his own. He told them that this person was probably hired by his parent to keep watch over him, but for some reason he lost his marbles. He didn't reveal his theory about him being hired by someone else though. He kept that for himself. He didn't want to worry his 3 companions, as he didn't think he would be staying in this city for much longer after this. Hey, it was only a joke, Tilda. No need to look at me like that. Rebecca and the rest were taking the information quite well. He thought they would be more surprised or maybe even angry. He reckoned that most commoners wouldn't like being involved in the dealings of nobles. Those aristocratic types didn't have good reputations with the common folk. Mighty Lord Roland, the slayer of small goblins, Sahilder shouted out from the side, while she leaned back against a tree. She did a little rough bow. He gave out a sigh while trying not to look at the idiot, and then he took the man's rapier. He examined it and noticed that it was indeed an enchanted weapon that had some runes engraved into it. It looked slightly more intricate than the weapon Sahilder used, and this was probably how the man managed to explode all those pierced trees. I think I won't need to buy that knife anymore. Well, at least Roland doesn't have a stick up his ass like most of those noble bastards have. Never get involved with those posh cunts, is what my mom always said. The large woman spoke up while laughing. The moment she did, she could feel Rebecca's elbow in her stomach. Ah, Roland is different. It's fine, you're probably right. That's why I'm trying not to get involved with them either. He had to agree that the nobles in this world were a peculiar bunch. They cared about things like reputation quite a bit, and also considered anyone that wasn't of noble birth not on their level. Still, they had a lot of money and prestige, so some would even kill if it opened the gates to noblehood. By the way, how did you even find me? Roland asked while looking at the red-haired archer, not really sure how they made this rescue happen. He had run towards the city gates, but even then, it would take them some time to reach him. They must have left sooner, so this meant that they probably knew where he was. Oh, we asked the lady in the inn about you. She told us where you went. Reina noticed some guy, always watching you. Clearly an amateur couldn't hide his presence at all. But you seem to know that, so we never asked. So, Sahilder then forced us to come here, as she was really warblar. Before Rebecca could continue speaking, she found herself in a chokehold from behind. The tall girl had wrapped one of her muscular arms around her party member, and was now choking her out. It was a coincidence. The tall woman pulled Rebecca away while Roland looked at the two, one of his eyebrows raised. Honey, why? Should we bury the body, or? Roland asked while looking at Reina, who was already undressing the man. The girl worked fast. She was also the one that always skinned the beasts and gathered up the loot. The man had some higher quality gear on him, and also a spatial bag. His sturdy gambeson armor would probably fetch a nice price. This side of the forest doesn't really have any monsters, so we can't count on them to clean up, Becky said, while looking at the man's spatial bag. She had wrestled herself away to safety and was now looking at the loot with sparkles in her eyes. Why do we need to bury him? Just leave the bastard to rot, was the opinion of their tank, that was now trying to clean the gore bits from her enchanted hammer. Won't someone question us if they find the body? We did kill a man here, Roland asked while slightly confused. Were the girls not worried about going to prison? The man did attack them, but would the authorities see it that way? He was also someone contracted by a noble, so it wasn't odd if they took that side. Question us. Who would do that? Rebecca asked, not really sure about the problem here. Oh right, I forgot where I was for a moment. You're right. The guards won't really care about an unidentified dead body in a forest that much. He remembered the type of world he was living in. There was no police force that would come knocking on his door, unless the person dead was someone high up. No one would care. His father would probably have to make some inquiries and pay out of his own pocket to even start an investigation. There was also the problem of this being the territory of another noble house. Would they even allow a low-rank baron to snoop around and ask questions? Even if they do, by the time anything gets done it will be weeks or months, not like they can get any evidence after so much time passes. I think we should still bury him just to be sure. Roland didn't think that any serious inquiry about this would take place, but it was better to be safe than sorry. Well, if you really want to get rid of the body then there are better options, Raina begged him. Roland raised his brow at Rebecca's statement, then just looked in bewilderment as the wolf girl stuffed the man's dead body into the spatial bag. He somehow fit inside. Apparently, if something was dead it could be placed inside. The enchantment that the bag had wouldn't allow living beings to be stuck into it, but dead bodies were fine. We can just drop him off in the dungeon. Either the monsters will eat the body or the dungeon will. The dungeons were a peculiar thing. Some theorized that they were living beings controlled by the dungeon core. Any killed living being, be it monster or human, would be slowly absorbed into the dungeon. Somehow the dungeon would receive nourishment from it, and this would allow it to produce more monsters for the adventurers to hunt. Is that okay? Roland scratched his head. The girls weren't at all distraught by what had happened. He had thought that killing a person would be seen as a more serious thing. He wasn't the one that delivered the finishing blow, and he understood that the man was someone that tried to kill him. Still, the whole thing didn't sit well with him. He would have to let go of his reservations, as this would probably be the best way of handling it, unless he wanted more trouble. Why wouldn't it? Not like anyone will come looking for that guy. He was the one that tried to kill you, not the other way around. Rebecca was making a lot of sense, not like he did anything wrong. He gave his party leader a nod. Then it's decided, now let us split the loot. But I see that you already took what you wanted there, Roland. Roland looked at the heavy rapier that he was holding. This weapon was a lot longer than his short sword, but the blade was also a lot thinner. It was clearly meant for thrusting motions and not cutting motions. It had a swept hilt, which was quite more intricate than the simple crossguard that his own short sword had. Well, Becky just covered her mouth after seeing the young man fidgeting around while trying to hide the long blade behind his back. That's fine, you can have it. We can sell his armor, don't think it will fit anyone here. He also has a spittle bag. You go play around with your new toy. Let me check this out first, Rebecca said while Roland moved to the side with his eyes narrowed. While the girls were taking the loot, Roland started examining the enchanted weapon. He swung it around while holding it in his right hand. The sword was, of course, different than his previous one and required a slightly different set of skills. He looked over to a tree and thrust the tip of this rapier into it. He then injected some of his mana into the weapon. The moment he did, he felt the weapon reacting, and just like when the man did it before, the part that had the sword tip stuck in it exploded into many splinters. He felt his mana decreasing by quite the chunk. This simple magical effect used up more than his mana arrow or even his mana barrier spell. He lost close to 100 mana points, which for him wasn't that much as he had over 1,000 by now. For others, it would be a large number. Pure warrior classes such as the man that was after him shouldn't have much above 500 MP even as a tier 2. This was something that he of course theorized by reading books and his own experience. He couldn't check as his identification skill wouldn't let him peek at other people's stats, at least not yet. Even with the added levels, fighter-type classes didn't have that many mana points, so he didn't think that he was that much off on his assumption. This was probably why that man didn't use his enchanted weapon all that often. After he tested out his new weapon, he got scolded by the girls that heard a loud explosion. It was time to go to the dungeon to dispose of the man's body. They went all the way over to the 3rd floor and threw the man's remains at 2 wereboars that were happy to munch on it. Roland was awfully quiet during the whole corpse disposing process, as he had many things to think about. He felt like some kind of villain who was trying to erase evidence. It didn't sit that well with him, but it had to be done if he didn't want others to be snooping around. You okay there? Rebecca asked while the three looked at him. Huh? Yeah, I'm fine, just thinking about some things. First time seeing a human die. You'll have to get used to it in this line of work, Sahilda responded while walking with her arms behind her head. The party was on their way out of the dungeon and just chatting. On the other hand, Raina just approached him and patted his head. There, Roland looked up at the wolf girl that was the closest to his height, just patting away. He still couldn't figure out what this one was thought about most of the time. He pulled his head away after getting treated like a small child that he actually was. I'm fine really, you guys don't need to worry. Still, thanks for the help. Roland rubbed his nose while lowering his head. In the end, these three had aided him without asking for much in return. He earned a couple of hard smacks to his back from Sahilda, and a nod from Rebecca that just said that he didn't need to worry about it. After returning to the city they split. The girls headed out to get rid of the man's belongings while Roland retired to his inn room. He flopped onto his bed face first and gave out a sigh. He recalled the battle that he just went through, but in reality, he felt like he didn't do much himself. He spent the first half running away and getting stabbed in the shoulder and his calf. The low-quality potions weren't able to close those wounds fully, so he was still hurting. I just run away. If the girls didn't show up, I'd be 6 feet under. He remained on the bed. After the adrenaline left his body, he felt really tired. The stress from the encounter that was keeping him on his feet slowly faded away, and he fell asleep. It was still the middle of the day, though. He had left early in the morning, and the whole event only took a couple of hours. After the little nap, he rolled over, his eyes wide open as he started to decide on his next move. Well, at least now I have a runic weapon. He jumped off his bed and went over to his wooden table. He placed the heavy rapier on it, and the crystal that was used to change his class next to it. I feel like I should try examining this rapier before using the stone. It's related to runes, and I am aiming to be a runesmith. It probably won't hurt if I play around with it. Ever since seeing Sahilder's enchanted hammer, he started getting more interested in this craft. What were runes really, and how did they even work? The books at the Arden Estate didn't have much information about them at all. They only had some basic theories that everyone knew. If you wanted anything more specific, you needed to get yourself accepted into a magic academy, or spend a lot of coin on research material and magic books. He moved his eyes closer to the bladed tip. The runes were concentrated on that spot, and they looked like strange symbols. From his previous tests, he knew that this runic enchantment made the tip explode things from the inside. It would somehow produce a concentrated blast of energy at the blade's tip. There was more than one runic symbol on it, but they were fairly large in scope and easy to examine. He focused on those symbols, and he started seeing tiny lines just like before. For some strange reason, the moment he focused on the runes, his vision got enhanced, and it felt like he was looking through a magnifying glass. He could clearly see those tiny lines just like last time. The closer he looked, the more of them he discovered. For some reason, they looked quite similar to electrical pathways on circuits that were also known as traces. Interesting. They went all throughout those runic symbols and even connected with each other, as if forming one closed circuit. After further examination, he noticed that the traces were lighting up in various colors. There were red ones, blue ones, and green ones. What if I activate the rune with my mana? He proceeded with the first test. He gently injected his mana into the weapon. He opened up his eyes wide as he tried not to miss anything. His blue mana entered the rune and started moving through those small pathways with quite the speed. The moment his mana reached the end of this runic circuit, the effect on the tip of the sword was activated. He made sure to hold the tip up without pointing it at himself or anything. The small controlled explosion occurred, just like before. Luckily, unless this sword was inserted into something, it didn't do all that much damage, and the range wasn't great either. He noticed some interesting things after doing this test. The mana is moving through the green and red paths, but not through the blue ones for some reason. Also these blue paths. He blinked a couple of times as he tried thinking about not seeing these lines. The moment he did, he saw the fluorescent lines that were over the runic pathways vanish as if he deactivated a skill. The moment he did that, he noticed that the blue lines that he saw weren't actually going over any of those pathways, as the red and green ones did. Wait, could it be that? But why? He had a sneaking suspicion of what this all meant. First, he glanced on his mana pool. After subtracting what he used up from activating the weapon and taking his mana regeneration into account, he still had less mana than anticipated. He clearly was losing some mana while looking at those runic symbols. This meant that he was subconsciously activating some kind of skill or spell effect. He started looking over his spells and skills. He finally ended up with two that could be the culprit. Debugger, or circuitry skills. If those lines are what I think they are, then it's probably the debugger skill. But are runes considered some type of computer program? Or circuitry? Maybe some strange mix of them both? Is it also responsible for that zooming in? Aren't those passive skills? Why am I losing mana? He wasn't sure, but it seemed that the red lines were something his debugging skill was showing him. It was probably presenting him faulty pathways that the rune had in itself. The green ones were the correct pathways that were already put in place, and the blue ones were the right ones that the red ones should probably be changed into. The runes also had other components besides these pathways. The blue lines probably showed the most efficient way to place those traces. I wonder if you rearrange those pathways if the efficiency of this rune would change. Maybe the power would also go up a notch? He was quite into it now. The problem was that he didn't know how to actually change this rune. He decided to grab a pen and paper and draw the improved version on it. Thanks to his calligraphy skill training, this wasn't really hard, but besides those runic pathways, there were components akin to transistors, resistors, capacitors, and various others. For now, he decided to just redraw the whole schematic with the improved version. If he focused, he could make the red pathways disappear, and this allowed him to follow the correct diagram. His quill moved slowly and precisely. He was so focused that he didn't even notice that this drawing took him multiple hours to make. He was so concerned about making a mistake that he did everything as slowly as possible. After finishing up, he grasped the paper with both his hands and looked at the finished product. His debugging skill was activated, and he could see everything lighting up in green. This indicated that he had managed to produce the correct rune diagram. He nodded to himself and placed the paper down on the desk, but the moment he did, he heard the voice of the world system speaking out. You have created the schematic for the lesser detonation rune. Highest, you have gained 1000 experience points. You have gained a new title, Runic Scholar. What? Chapter 16, Class Change. Roland stared spaced out for a moment after hearing those notifications. He quickly brought up his status window to look at his new title, not really sure what it was all about. Runic Scholar. A runic scholar is a person that is knowledgeable in the runic language and has managed to create or understands runes. Understand my ass, I just read through what my skill was showing me. Does this title even give me anything? Roland rubbed his chin. It seemed that creating a schematic was all that he needed to do. Maybe the system mistook his understanding of circuitry and computer programming as knowledge of runes. If so, then he might have been onto something. That 1000 experience points though, will I get just as much if I redraw other runes? That amount of experience points wasn't small at all. He would probably jump a couple of levels instantly if he had switched classes beforehand. He knew that he would lose out on some of those points after changing classes now, but part of the XP would be carried over. Think I'll be losing half of them. Shame. Still, this is a great discovery. This was something unprecedented. His debugging skill had given him an easy way to earn more experience and do it fast. He only needed to get his hands on some magical items. He then would be able to create improved schematics, which in turn would give him more experience. His skill allowed him to see every rune as a diagram. It even fixed any faulty pathways or misplaced components, shifting them into the correct places. The biggest problem would be actually acquiring the runes. They cost a hand and a leg. I wonder if I could sell those schematics or create some of my own. He knew that knowledge about crafting and creating runes was a trade secret. Other people would never disclose those, as their livelihood depended on it. He now had a way of producing complete rune diagrams, which meant that he wouldn't even need to look for a teacher or master for such things. He might even be able to sell those schematics for a large sum of money later on in his career, if he ever needed the funds. Okay, I think I'm getting ahead of myself here. I have no idea how to even create a rune. Even with this schematic, still need to change my class to monoscribe to be able to actually put magic to paper. He calmed himself down. He now felt that his future as a runesmith might be rosier than previously he expected. Still, he needed to actually get to that tier 2 class before he could even do anything with these rune schematics. He also noticed that without having to even look to that diagram that he just made, he could probably redraw it from memory. He attributed that to his fast learning and knowledge retention traits that he had gained by possessing this youth's body. He continued fiddling around with the runic rapier, but even after glancing at it from all sides and injecting more mana, he didn't find any more uses for his skills. Maybe if I understand more about runes, there will be other things I can do with this skill? He looked outside and it was already dark. Most people were asleep. He glanced over to the crystal that allowed people to change their classes and then nodded. He had tested out the runes, as he previously intended, so now was the time to change his class and get to work. Well, here goes nothing. He activated the crystal and found himself back in his old apartment building once again. He was down on the first floor just like before. Time to go up. He walked up all those stairs to his apartment room. The inside looked as bad as it always did. He tested the windows again, but they wouldn't budge, and the outside looked like the empty void as it did before. No changes here. Time to check if I can actually change my class. If not, then I might as well go back home and become a butler. He was slightly worried that there might be another error. He got that strange 0 elemental affinity after getting his first class. There could be another mishap with this strange system that would keep him from advancing yet again. He waited for the Windows screen to boot up. He then hovered his mouse cursor above the familiar icon that was used for class changing. He waited a moment before clicking the icon, scared of what he might find there. Finally, he mustered up the courage to go forward and clicked it. He was greeted to a familiar image of a tiny pixel art version of himself in a mage robe. The image had the usual 3-frame walking cycle as before. There is a lot of them this time. Previously, there was only one arrow pointing to his mage class. Now there were a lot of them. He hovered the mouse over one of those pixel sprites as he was unsure of what classes they were. The moment he hovered over one, there was writing on top of it. He could see the usual tier 1 classes becoming available. There was the warrior, the archer, even the blacksmith class that he was going to take on the next try. They were mostly filled with the basic of basic classes that you only needed a certain amount of stat points to reach. He finally managed to find the monoscribe one, but there was a nice surprise waiting for him. There is a runic monoscribe? Is it a variation of the regular monoscribe class? He tried recalling the books that he read in the past that described the way to get into the runesmith class. There was no mention of a runic monoscribe class, or of any other way of getting his desired Tier 2 class. This might have been a secret class, and he had a theory on how he was now able to select this class. Runic Scholar title, that must be it. He was quite sure that it had something to do with it. The books did describe classes that required certain titles to unlock, and this was probably one of them. The only other explanation that could also be true would be his debugging skill or his circuitry skill. The system already thought that they were related to runes, so it wasn't that far of a stretch. Maybe it's even the three combined. Roland hovered with the mouse on that runic monoscribe class, but it wasn't giving him any info besides the name. From the way it was named, he could deduce that it was focused on runes. It could also give him some bonuses to creating spell scrolls. He could also create rune schematics from other runes, which meant he could produce higher caliber spells while being at a lower class. But these names, wouldn't just rune scribe or runic scribe be better? Why make it so unnecessarily long? He shook his head at the naming sense of the person responsible for this, and then steeled his resolve. The first class was a freebie, but this one had some kind of test behind it. It could be anything simple from making a horseshoe when choosing a blacksmith class, to fighting some monsters in a closed room when going with a fighter class. He went over the classes again before choosing. He was mostly interested in the magic-related ones. He actually did find some interesting choices he could go with, like a mana warrior and a mana archer class. The requirements were probably having a mage-related class along with all the basic weapon proficiency skills that he had previously unlocked while he was training for the past 5 years. His adventurer sense tingled as he wondered what it would be like to be a magic swordsman, but then he remembered. He remembered that if he actually wanted to progress past a Tier 2 hybrid melee and magic class, he would need an advanced magic class as well. At most he could hope for some lesser choices that might even be worse than a regular Tier 3 warrior. He gave out a sigh after remembering that. He had to bring himself back to reality. He already found a hidden class related to runes. This was probably the best choice. Monoscribe class was also a popular choice for mages as their second Tier 1 class before going for an elemental mage at Tier 2. There were other choices like a ritualist that lead to a Tier 2 thaumaturge, and then into a Tier 3 warlock. There were other various options that gave you a wizard class or a sorcerer class. Each of those differed in the way they utilized their spells, and some were race or bloodline specific. If I go by its name, this class probably has all the bonuses of the previous one, so it is probably a better version, though that could mean that the trial for it could be harder to pass. He gulped before finally clicking on the runic mana scribe class sprite. The book he read before described the process of getting the mana scribe version of the class. In it, he would have to use his mana to inscribe one of his basic spells to paper. The ability to do so would be somehow given to the person taking the test. If the person had the aptitude, they would pass without any problems. If you tried doing it with no talent, then you would probably fail. If you failed, the knowledge of the skill would be forgotten. The VR headset that he previously used popped out once more and he didn't hesitate to put it on. He was greeted by a flash of light, then a quick scenery change. He was sitting in a chair in front of a large desk that was at an angle. There was a large empty parchment laid out on it. To the side, a white quill resting in an ink bottle. The room that he was in looked like the inside of a medieval castle. There were various books spread on bookshelves to the sides, and right in front of him was a large hourglass. It was at least 2 meters tall, and the sand was already slowly going down. That's probably the timer. It was one of the time trials. He would probably fail if he didn't manage to complete whatever he had to finish before all of that sand fell. He quickly looked at the closest things. There was a quill and a large piece of parchment there. He probably needed to write something there. Scribe class, need to write something down here, but what? He looked around and spotted a red book right on top of the desk. The cover was quite intricate, and it had a drawing of a rune on it. He took it into his hand and started reading, his eyes moving between the pages rapidly. This is the instructions to scribing a lesser fire orb rune onto a spell scroll. Thanks to his high intelligence and added memory traits, he was able to breeze through the entire book within a couple of minutes. He had also gained a reading proficiency skill by going through the Arden Estate Library, which allowed for faster reading and comprehension. The book described the basics of runic scribing, how you needed special ink and special parchment that was made from monster skin or other materials that could retain magic, to even be able for the process to take place. It described the theory behind focusing your mana onto the quill's tip and pushing it into the magical ink. The ink had certain properties that were required for the scribe's mana to be transcribed to paper and make the runic symbols function. This wasn't the hard part, that was to actually get the runic diagram the way you were supposed to. He had seen how intricate the lesser detonation rune was. The whole diagram that he drew of it fit on a large sheet of paper. He had to fit a similar diagram of this lesser fire orb rune on this parchment, but it had to be much smaller to make it work. Luckily this rune was less complex than the detonation rune. He couldn't just trace the large schematic in a 1-to-1 ratio, no, he had to make it small. He needed to guide the magical ink with the quill, making many tiny mana pathways between all of the components. These components were the rune parts. In this particular runic spell diagram, there were 3 main ones. There was the basic fire rune, that was the center of it all. Then there was the runic part that shaped everything into an orb, followed by parts that regulated the mana flow and made sure that the spell didn't collapse onto itself or explode. The last part was considered a type of control rune that was responsible for the spell's program. Wait, these parts are similar to logic gates, logic circuits? Do runes use binary? He could tell that the components in these runes had a striking resemblance to circuitry parts, like transistors, resistors, and more complex chips. They differed from the ones he knew by the fact that they were made from magic ink and not from physical components. These chip-like sections had things similar to logic gates in them. Interesting, I think my circuitry skill is helping me understand these runes better. Though I don't think I need to understand this just yet, I just need to copy the schematic onto the paper now. This was quite more complicated than he had expected. Regular mana scribes only needed to write down the incantations from the normal spells without much worry. The only real problem was running out of space on the spell scrolls. He actually needed to redraw the schematic and make it fit into a small rune that looked like a symbol. The runes possessed a maximal size. If they were too big, they wouldn't work. Basic mana scribing temporary gained. Basic rune scribing temporary. Basic rune mastery temporary. He had achieved the temporary skills that were needed to pass this test. A normal mana scribe would only gain the first skill, but this was an advanced version of this class, so he also achieved something related to runes. I should start, time is running out. He had finished the book and now was the time to act. He was always better with practical things than with theory, so he decided to test his skills and put quill to paper. He dipped his quill into the dark magical ink while focusing. The black liquid stuck to the tip like glue and let itself be guided to the large yellowy parchment. Roland took in a long deep breath before focusing on the task at hand. The tip of his quill hovered a fraction of a millimeter above the piece of large parchment. He started moving his hand, but he did it very slowly. The ink started slowly pouring onto the parchment while guided by his mana. The ink split into many tiny magical pathways that inscribed themselves onto the magical paper while guided by his mana. Slow and steady, his forehead started sweating as he concentrated. It was really difficult to guide this ink in the correct way. He would only know if he managed to do it correctly at the end, and his debugging skill didn't help him either. It could only pick up mistakes on an already created diagram or schematic, not during the process of inscribing. A couple of minutes felt like an hour as he continued to pour his heart out onto the paper. This was never meant to be easy, and he never tried it before, but thanks to his stats, he was slowly doing it. His large mana pool allowed him to be frugal with it, and his traits helped him keep focus. He was slowly moving his hand while writing the runic symbols. It looked as if he was writing 3 large letters, but in reality, the magical ink was getting pushed into the parchment, creating many tiny magical pathways and other various components. That would make the whole magical rune function after a person inserted their mana into them. When the hourglass was about half empty, he was finished with his scribbles. This was also when finally his debugging skill was activated, and also why he looked distressed. Most of it was red. The symbols and the pathways with the various components weren't looking up to par. A piece of parchment glowed after he was finished with his first attempt. It shone with crimson light. A glow of red rose up, as if trying to form into a round shape. The spell fizzled out before it could be completed, and the runic pattern of the magical paper vanished, indicating that the spell didn't form and that he had failed. Shit. He looked at the hourglass again. It was now past the halfway point, and he probably only had one more try to make this work. Okay, I can do this. The skill showed me where I went wrong. Just have to remember it. He closed his eyes and recalled the finished product. He could see it like a photograph in his mind, covered in red, blue, and green lines. He opened his eyes wide and went back to scribing. He still had some mana to spare. The second attempt was taking him even longer. He was afraid to blunder and fail, wasting a big chunk of money in the process. He tried not to look at the sand that was falling, afraid of getting distracted, but also worried that it would run out if he didn't hurry. With the last ounce of his mana points, he managed to finally finish. This runic spell didn't look like much. It consisted of 3 symbols. One was responsible for the fire rune, the second for the shape of the orb, and the last one for its discharge and control. There were many other hidden components, but after the magical ink dried, all of those could not be seen by the naked eye. A piece of magical paper shone once more. It was much brighter this time around. Tiny wisps of red light moved upwards and compressed themselves into a small orb. This orb was quite small and looked more like marble, but it was clearly radiating heat. Did I do it? He looked up at the hourglass and saw the last grain of sand sliding down. Everything blurred afterward, and he found himself back in his inn, down on the ground, as he had fallen off his chair. Shit, did I fail? Did the time run out? He quickly brought up his status screen and checked his class. It's there. Runic Mana Scribe class increases mana regeneration and lowers mana consumption while scribing spells and runes. He had also gained some class-related skills to boot. Basic Mana Scribing L. One skill allows scribing of basic spells to paper. Basic Rune Scribing L. One skill allows scribing of runes to paper. Basic Rune Mastery L. One passive skill increases comprehension of runes and lowers MP requirement for using them by a small margin. Roland sprawled out on the floor, quite tired from his first class change. He came unprepared but managed to somehow power through it. He would remember this blunder and prepare more when the time came. For now, he just wanted to sleep. I'll check everything out in the morning, too tired. Chapter 17. Future Plans. Roland awoke at the crack of dawn. He had passed out after attaining his new class, and was now a Runic Mana Scribe. His back was killing him as he didn't make it to his bed last night. He arose from the floor while grasping his neck. Is this how old age feels like? He grunted like an old man while standing up. The sun was just rising, so he probably had some time before any breakfast would be served at the inn. His thoughts turning to the girls, as he wondered if they managed to sell the loot of the fencer that attacked him. In yesterday's encounter, he was almost murdered by some musketeer wannabe. Luckily his party members had managed to save him in the nick of time. This made him consider leaving this city, while he was still in one piece. The words that the man said were still bothering him. He mentioned someone being glad if he was dead. That could have been a random sentence he construed, even a taunt, but could also mean that he was hired to do it. First person that popped into his mind wasn't his father, but the third sibling. He was never liked by the third son, mostly due to the fact that they both came from mistresses. He didn't think that his brother had it in him to go through with such a thing, nor was he smart enough or had the funds. There were also his other two siblings, but he didn't think they saw him as a threat. He was the fourth son and his mother wasn't even a mistress of the house. He had no claim to the estate whatsoever unless all of his other brothers died, or his father announced him as the heir, which would never happen. Were they afraid that he would become strong and claim their lives or something? That doesn't make any sense, but I guess people have killed for less before. He didn't think that it was his father. If he was angered about him staying here, he would probably just send an order for him to come back. The other suspects were the two wives. They also could have it out for him. They could see him as a threat against their sons if he ever managed to stand out. He didn't think that he was standing out too much. He wasn't even going to that magic academy, or the night academy. Roland then wondered if there could be another person that might want him dead, but he couldn't think of anyone else. He didn't really interact with anyone back in the Arden estate to cause any long-lasting grudges. He had two options: stay here and wait it out, or use the chance of his tail being dead and leave. I got my class. I got some coin. I even have a way to quickly level up now. No reason to stay here. He glanced at the three new skills that he had obtained. Two were for scribing. The first one was probably the one that you got if you were a common mana scribe, but he also had a second one just for runes. He knew that if he wanted he could scribe regular spells, but runic ones felt much more promising. Roland found it odd that he received the basic rune mastery skill. The books he read mentioned another one. This skill was called runecraft, and it was required to achieve the runesmith class. You could also only achieve it after becoming a blacksmith. If he followed the normal path, he would end up as an enchantsmith. He needed this runecraft skill to advance to runesmith. The books he read before described the way to get it. You needed to inscribe a rune on any type of item, and you could buy special skill books that told you how. They were probably similar to the one he got while going through his first class change. He rubbed his chin and thought some more. This skill that the runic mana scribe came prepackaged with didn't feel like a crafting skill, but more as an offensive skill. For now, he opened up his status screen to check his stats. Name, Role. Arden, L28 classes. T1 Mage, L25 Secondary, T1 Runic Mana, Scribe, L3 Main, P338, 338 M, P1000, 534, 1000, 534, Speed 422 Strength, 25, Agility, 29, Dexterity, 43 Vitality, 26 Endurance, 26 Intelligence, 83 Willpower, 60 Charisma, 12 Luck, 6. He noted that he managed to gain 2 levels from the saved over XP. He was a bit annoyed that he lost some of it due to drawing that schematic too early. The secondary class option is now unlocked. The moment you unlocked a second class, you could choose one of your previously gained classes as a secondary one. With a secondary class, you were able to keep this class special effect. His secondary class, which was now a mage, gave him bonuses to mana and mana regeneration. You could only have one secondary class, and you could switch them once per day. No outside items were needed to do this. Roland took note of his meager physical stat growth with this class. His intelligence, dexterity, and willpower seemed to be going up though. This was his second tier 1 class, This world system didn't count this as separate levels. They all added to the main level, which caused people to gain those levels slower than before. Even if it seemed that he made the jump from L1 to L3 of his new class, in actuality, he was going from L25 to L28 of his main level. He knew this would happen. There was a reason why people started gaining levels slower, and why most of them tried not to get a third tier 1 class. Roland was glad that he had his debugging skill. It offered him a faster way of getting through his tier 1 conundrum. He also believed that he could use this schematic making bug, even after he changed his class to a blacksmith later on. This was also why he needed to get that hammer from his party member. He gained a whopping 1,000 experience points for that one schematic. He came to the conclusion that it was probably something a tier 2 class would normally be able to do, but here he was doing it as a tier 1, which meant he got more experience for doing something above his level. Before heading out, there was one more thing that he had to check. He grabbed the heavy rapier that was still on the table, and he injected his mana into the weapon to trigger the rune's effect. With that, a loud boom was heard from his room that woke up the person sleeping in the next room. He could hear someone banging on the other side to make him quiet down. This almost made him forget to look at his MP points to check his theory. P338, 338 M, P1435, 1534, P422, 422. Just as he suspected, he used up less mana to activate this weapon this time around. The rune mastery skill was lowering the cost of powering the runes. The decrease was meager in scope at only 1%, but what if he continued increasing the skill? Could he get it up to 10%? Maybe an advanced version of this skill could be gotten later, which would further decrease the requirements. Could he get a class with the advanced version of it in the future was the big question. Maybe with this skill, combat with runic weapons could be somehow manageable? Roland wanted to test this theory out in the future as he had no way of doing it now. He finally got out of his room to get something to eat. He wanted to meet up with the girls and discuss a couple of things. He headed to the Adventurer Guild and could see people were walking out to open their shops. He became slightly nostalgic. He was already over 5 years in this world, but this was the first place that he actually enjoyed living in. He found himself a quirky party that was quite dependable. They even rescued his behind from getting murdered in broad daylight. He spent quite the interesting half a year in this place. He decided to change locations and wanted to do it fast. He also felt bad about breaking the party up when he left. The girls would need to find reliable backline support like him. There weren't really many mages in this line of work at the lower levels. Most mages were put into academies that left them as tier 2 mages. They could just level up by researching more spells and not killing monsters. This was also why Roland was able to reach L25 of his mage class so soon. Besides killing goblins, he was leveling up his spells. The more he used them, the faster they leveled up. Even though he didn't need to do it while in combat, it did hasten the leveling process. Still, most people didn't want their kids leveling up in dungeons, so spending some years in a magic academy till they got the hang of casting was a preferred option. Though this only concerned people that could actually afford to pay for the exorbitant prices of those prestigious academies. Roland went past the tavern that he had his first drunk stupor with his party members. It was called the Iron Flagon. The booze that was served, there was all hard liquor. Anything below 20% was frowned upon. He recalled a couple of instances of the girls from his party getting drunk in there. The quiet wolf girl always got chatty on those occasions, which made him chuckle. He thought back to his family. He hadn't heard a word from them during the time he was here. He also didn't write any letters to any of them. He once considered writing some to Martha, but now, he was planning on going into hiding. This meant that he needed to lay low and not spread any information about his whereabouts. He finally arrived at the Adventurer Guild. It was the place that he always met with the girls. He pushed the door open and was greeted by a smell of sweat. Many adventurers were already shuffling back and forth inside. The people in this world woke up early as to not waste the light of day. "Hey Roland, good morning." Roland spotted Rebecca at the usual spot waving at him. She had quite a big smile on her face as if something good had happened. This made Roland think that she might have fetched a good price for that man's armor. He walked towards his party. Sailor had a coin purse in her hands and was looking at it while Raina, the wolf girl, was dozing off at her seat. The girl was always bad at getting up in the morning. Some drool was even dripping from her mouth as she concentrated on not hitting the table with her face. "Good morning, you're awfully chipper today. A good deal at the shop?" Roland sat down on his chair that creaked. The moment he asked, Rebecca waved him over. He raised his eyebrow, but leaned forward. She apparently wanted to whisper her answer into his ear. "Yeah, that guy was loaded. We found some small gold coins in his spatial bag along with some other things." Raina already swiped some throwing daggers for herself. His gear also fetched a nice price. Roland nodded. Apparently with the sold equipment, the girls managed to get over 20 small gold coins. He already had 15 of those in the dimensional bag beforehand, after selling his light armor, some potions, and other weapons. The girls received 5 more small gold coins. Roland took a second to digest this information. For someone just trailing him, he was carrying a lot of cash. Was this a normal amount of gold someone at Tier 2 had, or was it really a payment for taking him out? Did he perhaps have any letters in his bag? Ones with a red seal, for instance? Rebecca shook her head and shrugged. No, he only had the usual stuff. Roland narrowed his eyes, as this made it sound like this wasn't the first time that these girls had done someone in. He was hoping of finding more clues, but it made sense that there were no letters. Even if the man received such a thing, he would probably burn it to get rid of the evidence. He also could have met face to face with his contractor. His head was apparently worth more than 1 gold coin, which he wasn't sure was that flattering. While he was thinking, he noticed that his party leader's eyes were sparkling. You sure are happy there, like money that much? Damn right I do, he replied loudly before lowering her voice and nodding. She didn't really want the other adventurers to know that they had some coins to spare, as these were dangerous times they lived in. It wouldn't be surprising if you got backstabbed during a dungeon expedition and robbed by other adventurers. There were even some of those types that actually specialized in robbing others during dungeon expeditions. But anyway, what are we going to do now? Think we should leave the city for now? Rebecca sat down in her chair and looked at the others with a slight frown on her face. Roland kind of knew what this was about as he nodded. Sorry, didn't think I'd get you involved in something like this. It's not your fault. You are different than those other nobles. Sahilder smacked the table, that rattled with force. The drowsy Raina fell forward and got her face smacked, which finally woke her up. How about we take one of those guard missions to another city? We won't have to pay the traveling costs. Rebecca continued with her proposal, while Roland replied with his own plans in mind. Well, I wanted to tell you something about that. I want to leave the city, but alone. I was thinking about quitting as an adventurer for now at least, but I think that you 3 should leave the city. I think your involvement with me might bring trouble your way. Roland wasn't sure what information the man had reported to the Baron, or to the person that tried to kill him. The looks of the 3 female members from his party could be known, and they could be implicated in the future. He of course didn't want that to happen, but only saw distancing himself from them as an option. You think we are afraid of some trouble? Sahilder smacked the table again while looking angrily at Roland. Apparently not. Don't worry about us, Roland, but you seem to have already made up your mind about this. Rebecca chimed in while looking at the close to 11-year-old Roland. The boy nodded as he wanted to leave the city and move on. He already had his class and now needed a place to train his crafting class. Yes, I did. I'm actually not really fit to be a mage, so I've decided on choosing one of the crafting classes. The girls were surprised by this reveal. From their point of view, the youth was quite talented as a mage. Even though he only knew the basic spells, they packed quite a punch. If he managed to reach a Tier 2 mage, he would be a force to be reckoned with. Eh? But you are clearly suited to be a mage, Rebecca asked while confused. Okay, let me explain. It's like this. He made a short summary about him having someone in 1,000,000 constitution and having 0 elemental affinities to get him any of the basic mage classes. He then explained about runes, and that he would be going for a smithing class that would somehow let him profit from his large mana pool. So that's how it is. Raina just kept nodding during the explanation. Rebecca did the same while Sahilder's head started exuding smoke when he started talking about runes and how they fit into his plan. I got it, sounds reasonable. Rebecca shrugged without having much to add to this explanation, not like she could convince this boy at this point. She also felt that Roland was free to choose his future. So when will you be leaving? Him, I'd like to today or tomorrow. Don't really want to remain here for too long after what happened yesterday. I see, you probably won't tell us where you are heading? Roland just nodded while frowning. It wasn't like he didn't trust them with keeping secrets, but in this world, there were ways of getting information out of people even if they didn't want to talk. Mostly with the help of special spells or potions that made people sing. The girls understood this, so they didn't make much of a fuss. We can always meet up in the future. You never know, when you are famous adventurers, I'll be sure to make you some runic weapons. Roland noticed that the atmosphere around the table got strange. Even the wolf girl was looking sad. He didn't think that they would be saddened this much by him leaving. Him, you sure you want to make a promise like that? I want at least a greater rune in my weapon, said Rebecca while Sahilder replied afterward. I want some armor. Legendary runic daggers, was what Raina mumbled under her nose while staring at Roland with anticipation. Don't go overboard. I don't even know how long it will take till I can make lesser runic weapons. 3 girls grinned at him and started listing him the types of weapons and armor they wanted him to make. While we are on the subject of runes, Sahilder, could you lend me that hammer for a couple of hours? Roland looked at the muscular girl with a glint in his eyes. He just had to get that hammer before he left. Chapter 18. Farewell. After some convincing, and a lot of yanking with the help of Rebecca and Raina, they managed to peel the hammer off of Sahilder. Roland could barely hold this weapon, swinging it was out of the question. I just need it for my research. I won't damage it, I promise. All of you magic types say that before something goes wrong. Apparently Sahilder was still hesitant about giving him her warhammer for inspection. He wasn't sure what it was about, and he didn't have enough time to hear the whole story. Fine, you can have it, but I'm staying in the room with you. Roland just shrugged as he didn't care. This was even better as he didn't need to carry the heavy thing all the way to his in-room. The two other girls didn't join them, finding it too boring to watch Roland play around with runes. I'll go check out if there are any worthwhile escort missions on the notice board. We can meet up at the tavern later. Rebecca and Raina left to go prepare for their own journey away. They had also decided to go somewhere else. This wasn't the only town with a dungeon close to it. The next couple of hours weren't all that exciting. Roland had Sahilder place the hammer in his room on the floor, afraid that if he placed it on his flimsy table, it would give out under the weight. He then took out a sheath of paper and got to copying. He wasn't using his scribing skill, he just read through the runes diagram with the help of the overlay that his debugging skill gave him. He took his time, as he didn't want to mistakenly mess up this new schematic. After the first 30 minutes passed, he heard a big thud behind him. It was his big muscly friend dozing off on his bed. He sniggered at her and then went back to work. You have created the schematic for the lesser impact rune highest drawing skill L1 reached. You have gained 1000 experience points. He smiled slightly after hearing the system awarding him the experience points. He even managed to upgrade his drawing skill to the next level. He used to have the basic drawing skill, but now it finally broke through. Progress of the skill had stopped at the L9, just like all the other basic ones. Now further upgrading was possible. This made him think that it was caused by him receiving the runic mana scribe class. He figured that the diagrams were probably considered drawings by this leveling system. Previously he leveled this skill by sketching things, also painting was another skill altogether. He also managed to recreate the diagram fully, earning another highest graded rune. From what Roland knew, the lesser runes were the worst ones on the market. After them came the common runes, then followed by greater runes, grand runes, and at the very top the legendary runes. The last ones were mostly only mentioned in fables, and not much was known about them. This wasn't all, as the runes went into even more subcategories. In sequence, they were lowest, low, intermediate, high, and highest. A lesser rune with the highest subgrade was comparable to a common rune with the lowest subgrade. But this was something that Roland would figure out at a later date. He rolled up the schematic that he just made, and placed it together with the previous one he created. He now had two lesser rune schematics with no flaws. He gave out a sight, while thinking, could he scribe these runes on scrolls and sell them to people? He didn't think the impact rune and detonation runes worked well by themselves. They only showed their true colors when attached to weapons. The impact rune either increased the mass of the weapon it was on or used gravity. He wasn't sure. He had asked Sahilder about her hammer. She told him that the heavy hammer part increased in weight the moment she activated the rune. She needed to time her attacks well to make use of it, but when she did, she could deliver devastating blows with it. The detonation rune created a small controlled explosion on the tip of a weapon. Unless you managed to poke someone with it, it wasn't that useful. If he scribed it onto a scroll, it would only cause a small explosion, while the impact rune might make the scroll just heavier. This kind of showed him the limitations of some of the runes. The fire orb rune was the only one he could see working as a spell scroll. He only needed to get it to target enemies. Maybe if he combined it with the detonation rune, he could turn it into some kind of targeted grenade spell. Come to think of it, I need to make a schematic for that fire orb rune too. While speaking out loud, he heard a strange sound. He turned his head towards the loud noise, only to see his muscle friend snoring on his bed. She was just sprawled out with her hands and legs in an X shape. He could hear her snoring loudly while scratching her belly, which made him squint his eyes. Oh right, she was here. Hey, I'm done. You can take your hammer now. The large Goliath female just snored some more and rolled onto the other side. There wasn't an ounce of femininity in this tanky girl. Roland scratched his forehead before placing both his hands to his mouth as if he was going to shout. Hey, is that free wine over there? You can drink all you want, no way. He made sure to yell towards her direction, and he almost instantly got a reaction. She raised her head up high, her eyes opening wide and drool running down her mouth. Free wine. She was still a bit drowsy, so her words didn't come out right, but instead of wine, she saw her party member snorting at her while laughing. Finally you're up. You can take your hammer now. Huh? No wine? It took a few seconds for Sahilder to realize that she was made a fool of. Her eyes narrowed and she moved forward with haste, putting Roland into a headlock while rubbing his head with her knuckles. Why, you little? Roland didn't have time to react, and not like he was scared. He got his scalp rubbed and he pleaded for mercy. Soon enough, he was free to go, his hair all ruffled up. Sahilder took her hammer back and examined to see if it was working right. Roland took a glance while thinking back to moments earlier. Was I always this childish? He contemplated. He could have just woken the girl up normally, but for some reason, he had the urge to plug her nose, or even splash water on her face as a prank. The cogs in his brain started to turn. He had a few theories to go with. The scariest one of them all was that he had fused his psyche together with the boy that was once the true Roland. He thought back to the past. He did enjoy climbing those trees at the Arden estate, though he never considered the kids there to be his peers. Before he could have a mental breakdown about himself, he was brought back to reality by Sahilder. "Hey, you okay there, Roland? You look kind of pale. Did I rub that big melon of yours too hard?" He momentarily tossed his identity conundrum to the back of his head, while frowning at Sahilder. "I'm fine. I bet Rebecca's waiting for us at the Adventurers Guild. We should go." Roland still had some of his stuff in this room. He didn't pack up just yet. He wanted to do it after having said his goodbyes with the silly trio. They might have not been around each other for that long, but they have managed to form a bond. He couldn't actually remember others being so nice to him even back in his old life. Yeah, I'll be sure to escort you. Now, noble lord, let us depart to the Adventurers Guild. Tilda, she did some misaligned bow, and then opened the door in front of Roland. She stood there like a knight that was holding the way open for their noble lady. "Please, don't call me that. People will think that it's actually true." The two finally left. Roland was going to use the train. He had come to the city for his getaway. It didn't have a direct road to Edelgard, but it was a lot faster than going by horse carriage. It took them 10 or so minutes to get back. Rebecca and Raina were already sitting at the usual table with a piece of paper in hand. "So you two lovebirds finished?" Rebecca called out while whistling at Roland and Sahilder. The Goliath lady looked ticked off by that remark. "What would I do with a little brat like that? He doesn't even have hair growing down there." "Oh, so you've seen it?" Rebecca stuck out her tongue while Sahilder got increasingly maddened. "Quiet down, you two. The idiots in this guild will misunderstand," Roland responded, while covering his face with a hood. The other adventurers in the guild just laughed from the side, while also whistling. "Hey, it's little Goblin Slayer, Emperor, and his harem. They are being even more intimate than usual." After garnering some notoriety, he had gained another title for being the only man in a mostly female party. "We should ask the Squirt Emperor about some tips, boys." The older adventurers called out from the side while sniggering at the party of 3 teenage girls. The girls were around the age of 16 or 17, and the youth that was with them was believed to be 12. The Goliath girl turned around while shaking her fist at some of the men. They in turn just laughed more while backing off, not wanting to get smacked in the face. After successfully scaring off the other adventurers, she sat down at the table while grumbling, her hammer leaning against her chair. "So, you got it?" Rebecca nodded while bringing out a piece of paper. It was a job offering for steel and silver-ranked adventurers. It was an escort type of mission. They were going to be the bodyguards for a large caravan of merchants. This was quite a common type of job listing, and was mostly safe as bandits would rarely attack such large convoys. One more thing, Roland, you have your second class now, right? You should go update your adventure card," Rebecca mentioned while Roland nodded. The requirements to go from bronze to a steel adventurer was getting a second tier 1 class and having finished some missions. Roland and his party were frequent visitors to the dungeon, and he had gone through the minimum trial period of half a year, so he was now eligible for it. "Okay, I'll be right back. This shouldn't take long. You three should probably discuss a couple of things." He turned around and left. He went over to the same lady that had given him his first adventure card. "Hey there, Miss Celica. I've obtained my second class." He gave a quick explanation, and the lady nodded. She took the same identification orb out as before to get it checked. He didn't like that they were scanning his status, but not like he could do much about it. There were enough benefits to working as an adventurer to let them got through with the examinations. The card update didn't take that long, as they just needed to change it from bronze to steel. "Here you go, have a nice day." The lady bowed slightly while showing him away. There were many other people waiting in lines, and there was more work to be done. "So how does it feel to move up in the world?" "It's just a notch up from bronze. You know well that unless you get to silver you won't really be taken seriously." Roland replied to Rebecca's remark after he returned to the table. He also noticed that there was a bag laying on the table right next to where his sitting spot was. "Isn't this your storage bag?" "Aye, it is. You'll find some coin in there to get you started. Think of it as a little parting gift from us. We did agree on an equal split." He took the bag and glanced at it. He clearly wanted to take it, but while reaching out he stopped his hand. "What? Why are you hesitating? Did you forget that we got that other bag from that guy? It's twice the size of this one. You can take it." "Yet just take it." "Take the 3," called out while he nodded and grabbed the bag. He strapped it to his side while hiding it under his robe. He would peek inside of it when he was alone. "Thanks." He rubbed his neck, feeling a bit uncomfortable about the generosity of his party members. He had thought that having gotten rescued by them was enough. It didn't feel right to ask about more gold or items while splitting. The girls smiled after seeing the youth act all shy. "So when will you be leaving?" they asked him. "Probably today. I think my ride leaves for the next city tonight." He would be going far away. There would be a lot of stops, and he would have to go to switch between different magic trains on the way to reach his destination. "That's so want us to send you off?" "You don't have to." An awkward conversation ensued while the group of 4 stood up and left the Adventurers Guild. The girls would be heading to a new city and be trying to get themselves a new fourth party member there. They were already close to maxing out their second, Tier 1 class, and would probably be reaching a Tier 2 class in the foreseen future. It didn't take long for Roland to get his belongings from the inn. With the storage bag carrying around all of his items would be quite easy. Back outside, the group huddled closer. Roland wasn't really thinking about them following him all the way to the train station, so this would be as far as this would go. So, this is it, don't forget about us, and remember you promised to make us those weapons and armors. Rebecca replied happily while holding both her hands to her hips. Sahilder delivered a smack to his back that made him almost fall, as she always did. Yet take care of yourself, almighty lord. Take care, Raina replied in a monotone voice while twiddling her thumbs. I will, and don't worry, I'll probably be stuck in a blacksmith shop for quite some time. Thun finally came, and he turned around. He wasn't good with things like this, and he wasn't sure if he would be able to see these three oddballs in the foreseen future. He would be sure to remember them, as the time spent in this city was something that he cherished. He thought that this was for the best. He didn't want to involve the girls in his family problems. The three girls remained in place while waving, calling out to him once in a while, which made Roland wave with his hand one last time without turning around. He finally made a turn, leaving the view of the three that were watching him from afar. So he's gone, huh? Yes, Sahilder asked while Rebecca replied, her eyes getting suspiciously moist. You're never good with things like this. At least he didn't have to see that ugly face of yours covered in snot. Unbeknownst to Roland, his party members weren't taking the separation all that well. Sahilder's face contorted into quite the mess and tears were running down her cheeks, snot all over. She started sobbing uncontrollably, which made the other two follow suit. Haman, let us go to the tavern. Stop crying, you're making the people uncomfortable. Who's crying? I'm not crying. Some people could see a Goliath female with her head down and two other girls patting her back. They looked to be saddened while walking into the city. The reason for their distress was close to reaching the train station that would take him on a trip through the large kingdom. The journey would take at least a week as he needed to change stations multiple times. Some of them would even require him to use regular carriages. Well, farewell, my friends. It was fun while it lasted. He sat down at the train station and waited. An old part of his life was coming to an end. What waited for him next was unknown. He was nervous to a certain extent, but also excited. Nervous about the unknown, excited about the possibilities of his future life that was ready to begin. Chapter 19. New Beginnings. What do you mean he's gone? A loud booming voice was heard, followed by a sound of shattering furniture. A chair was thrown at a wall, and it fractured into many pieces on impact. This all was happening inside a large room. It looked to be some kind of noble house. There were various paintings and bookshelves in this room, along with a big crest that had Arden written underneath. Please, my lord, calm down. Adam the butler used a handkerchief to wipe some sweat from his brow. He had just arrived at the Baron's office with bad news. His son was missing. The man responsible for keeping watch over him was nowhere to be found, and just as him, the boy was gone. The man didn't send in the weekly report as usual, and by the time they sent someone else to check, there was no Roland to be found. Hey, the report said that the adventure party that he was traveling with wasn't in the city of Carwin either. They might have just left the city together with the young master. Wentworth Arden, Roland's father, stood there behind his desk. In a fit of rage, he had tossed his chair at the wall, missing the butler but a hair. Get out and send more people, and bring me a new chair. The butler just bowed while getting out of the room with haste. The Baron moved over to the couch that was to the side, and grabbed himself a bottle of schnapps to soothe his nerves. He looked to be quite angry while he drank. He had seen the whole report. The man that was supposed to keep watch was gone. There were a couple of possibilities, some better than the others. The possibility of the boy just going to a different city was there, but the disappearance of one of his men was strange. The Baron smelled some foul play, and he was angry that the possibility of his son's death was out there. Did he escape? The man spoke out before taking a big gulp straight from the bottle while contemplating. He knew well that finding his son would be difficult if he decided to run away. He didn't have enough pull to get the Adventurers Guild to give out his location. Only large ducal houses or the king could achieve such thing. The adventurer guilds around the kingdom were very adamant with their rules. They also had some powerful adventurers that the kingdom wouldn't be willing to go against if push came to shove. Or did he perish? This was the other option on the table, one that he didn't want to believe in. He shook his head while taking a swig from the bottle again. His chair was already on the way, and he needed to get back to work. Somewhere far away, the estranged son in question was sitting in a large moving train. He was looking at the passing scenery with boredom. He had been on the road for a week already. There was no tea or internet here, so he was left with staring at the scenery or reading books. He had already gone through the storage bag that his previous party members gave him. He wanted to go back and throw it at their faces as they left 10 small gold coins inside. This was more than he expected. 5 small gold was the largest sum he was willing to take from the 20 that the girls had. He couldn't do his rune scribing as he didn't have any materials. Neither would it look good to just do it out in the open in a moving train. He had no books to study up, either, nor was he feeling sleepy, and that was probably due to his sleep-resistant skill. This long journey had taken over a whole week, but now it was close to being over. He had seen the scenery change quite a bit through his travels. The Cauldrus Kingdom's climate wasn't too warm or too cold. You could see many grass fields and forest areas scattered throughout the land. The more you went in, the more the climate changed. Where he was going, it looked to be colder, more of autumn-like weather. He was also traveling into lands with a higher altitude, as many rocky structures appeared. While on the last stretch of his travels, he saw the scenery turn rocky, and they were going into a mountain range. There was a reason why this city was known for having blacksmiths. Now arriving at Edelgard, please take all of your belongings. While going out, the train drove up at the last stretch. The city of Edelgard was built into a large mountain. You could even see some mine shafts sprinkled in the background, and smoke coming out of them. To see this while the train moved through a large bridge that connected two city parts. Under it was quite the large gorge. A fall from here would spell certain death. This city made him think about dwarfs from some of the fantasy books he used to read back on Earth. In them, it was always stated that this race liked to build their cities on, or in mountains. Some even had ones placed deep underground. He was finally here. He didn't need to carry his luggage thanks to his spatial bag this time around. I have arrived. He walked out half nervous and half excited. This was a new place filled with opportunities that could come to fruition. This was also a place filled with uncertainty, which made his belly feel like he had a swarm of butterflies in it. There was no one to greet him here or help him out. He was truly alone. He wasn't lonely though, as he was used to working solo. The short time he spent with those three girls was the exception to the rule. Ding, 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 he heard the sound of a large bell. He turned to it, and saw two people in robes. The robes were white, but due to time they now looked gray. There were some yellow patterns here and there, but the most glaring thing was the large yellow sun symbol on their backs. These strange robe-wearing people were close to the exit, so he needed to move there. Roland already had an idea of who these two people were. Praise the sun, traveler. May the goddess Solaria bless you on your travels. Would you like to join us for prayer? The person in the robe called out while waving the bell around. The voice was an older man. Next to him stood a second person that was smaller, and of the female gender. She was holding a large plate in both her hands, and holding it out as if asking for something. Roland knew about the identity of these people. They belonged to the Church of the Sun. They worshipped the goddess Solaria. From his more modern point of view, he found people like this a bit strange. Nevertheless, people from this church were granted the acolyte class that could then evolve into the cleric. You could even become a paladin. A sound of metal dropping on a plate was heard as Roland dropped some copper coins on the collection plate. Even though he never liked churches, in this world they were in a strong position. The class-changing stones that were a necessity were actually produced by these people. No one knew exactly how it happened. The churches only revealed that it was all thanks to the power of their god. The stones were rumored to be a gift from the gods that allowed people to change classes and grow in power. This church wasn't the only one that was able to produce this commodity. Thanks to that, the prices didn't go that overboard, even though the stones weren't that cheap. Praise the sun. Roland nodded while passing the two priests that saw their next target behind him. He finally left the train station and went outside. He could see a lot of smoke coming out of the chimneys from the city. Most of the houses were made from rock or bricks. It was hard to spot any wooden structures here as he passed. His first destination was the Adventurers Guild. Even though there was no dungeon located next to the city, it still operated in it as in the others. The adventurers here were mostly used as hired muscle, and they worked as bouncers, guards, and even cleared out some monsters that showed up from time to time. Even without dungeons, monsters existed in the wild, so there was always some work to be done. He asked for directions and headed out. He followed a dark rocky road that would lead him to the guild. While walking, he took in the sights. The first thing he noticed was a large number of dwarves. There were also another interesting race that he didn't see before, gnomes. From what he knew, this race was very creative and intelligent, which made them good crafters by default. In contrast to dwarves that liked to work with heavy weapons and armor, the gnomes prided themselves in making more intricate machinery. The magical trains that he was using were apparently invented by the gnome tinkerers. They also worked as normal craftsmen, specializing in smaller items like trinkets and magical accessories. Roland needed to find a new base of operations. From what he could tell, he needed to get himself a job at one of the scribing shops. Making magical scrolls was also a business, and many adventurers used these one-time magical items for various occasions. While going through the robust-looking city, he finally arrived at the Adventurer Guild. The guild was slightly different than the previous one, but it had a similar layout with the same job listing notice board. The people inside didn't care much about the small robed figure that entered. His short height wouldn't really raise any eyebrows, as there were many gnomes and dwarves sprinkled all over the place. He got himself a city map, which he had to pay, but thanks to his Steel Adventurer ranking, he got a small 5% discount. It wasn't much, but saving even a copper coin was a win in Roland's eyes. He looked at this map first. He needed lodging, and there were some inns and taverns that he could stay nearby. He preferred the former, as they didn't smell like booze all the time, and weren't as loud all into the night. He had walked off the stiffness after leaving the train, and it was getting late, so he decided to visit one of the inns that were in his price range. He didn't really care about the quality of the bed. He could mostly sleep anywhere, even on the floor. Even though he had a lot of coins on him, he didn't want to waste them on lavish living, as he didn't know how much money he would be able to earn here. Roland headed to the closest inn that was marked for bronze and steel adventurers. He was lucky back in Carwin, so he thought that he might be lucky this time around as well. Singing crow in, Roland looked at the wiggly sign that was getting pushed by the wind. The inn was quite large and had 4 levels to it. He pushed the creaky doors open and was greeted by a nice smell. Inside, he saw a couple of patrons sitting on some wooden benches. They were eating food and drinking some beverages, probably alcoholic ones. While distracted, he moved forward, looking for some kind of counter with the bartender or someone that looked like an owner. While going through the crowd of people, he felt someone bumping into him. "Hey, watch out where you are going." He was still wearing his robe, and his face was slightly covered so not everyone would notice that he was just an 11-year-old youth. Roland raised a brow as the person that shouted out had quite the high-pitched voice. He looked down and saw someone smaller than him with pointy ears. Sorry about that, didn't see you there." The person that he was looking at a more prolonged face, making her look more like an elf than a human. Besides the long ears, her eyebrows were quite long and she had noticeable high cheekbones. This was apparently a gnome girl of unknown age. "You got eyes, use them." "Hey Elsie, stop flirting with the customers and go back to work," someone called out from the back, which made the small gnome girl grit her teeth before moving away. She was carrying a plate with unwashed dishes that looked oversized in her small hands. Roland shrugged and moved over to the bar counter, where he requested a room to stay in. The pricing was a bit higher here than at his first inn, but he attributed it to this being a larger city in which people probably earned more. The door creaked open, and he was greeted to a small room with 1 bed and a table with 1 chair next to it. These items were made from wood in contrast to all the stone and brick buildings. He tested out the mattress that was again just some straw stuck into some cloth. He smirked to himself while thinking that he was already used to bad sleeping conditions like these. He sat down on the chair and started unpacking his belongings. He placed his quill, along with some other materials for drawings, on the table. He could finally draw the schematics for that lesser fire orb rune. "You have created the schematic for the lesser fire orb rune. Highest, you have gained 1000 experience points." It took him an hour to finish up with the schematic. He was getting better at redrawing those diagrams. This rune was also something he drew from his memory, and not while looking at a weapon with his debugging skill. He memorized it during his class trial, and was even able to achieve the highest subgrade. He rubbed his eye with his knuckles while feeling tired. The bumpy train ride and lack of sleep were slowly getting to him. He placed the sheet of paper next to the other 2 schematics while looking down. In his mind, he felt like he was cheating the system. He could just draw from memory and get large amounts of experience from it. He would need to spend a few days fighting monsters to get the same number of XP as he did now. Roland looked at each schematic. He wanted to abuse this leveling shortcut to its fullest. To maximize on it, he needed more runes to work with, but he also was thinking about other possibilities. Namely, creating his own diagrams while analyzing the old ones he had. He nodded to himself while rubbing his chin. He needed to slowly analyze these 3 schematics. He needed to find similarities in them. If he could figure out what these 3 runes had in common, he might be able to find a pattern. He would then be able to perhaps create his own custom runes. From what he was able to ascertain, all of these runes possessed traces. These magical pathways carried the mana that a user inserted into the rune to create an effect. From his perspective, the whole rune was some sort of closed circuit that, when given energy, activated the given spell effect it was programmed for. There were several components scattered over these schematics, buried deeply into the runic symbols. He had seen them during his trial while scribing the fire orb rune. He had followed the book's instruction to recreate them, but he didn't fully understand their purpose. He was like an assembly line worker that assembled an item without knowing the intricacies of the parts he was working with. He tickled his nose with his quill while thinking that he wouldn't figure out much from the schematics about those components. He would actually need to experiment with the parts themselves while scribing to actually get anywhere. The thing he could do was try to relocate these unknown elements on the sheet of paper and see if his debugging skill reacts in any way. Roland sighed out loud, as he already needed to spend at least an hour redrawing the diagrams. Now he needed to do it while adding random parts, and he had no way of copy-pasting as you would in a computer program. He also had the idea of cutting out parts he drew on paper. He would then try relocating them over completed schematics while replacing the other components. He tried doing it by drawing some of the rune parts onto a smaller piece of paper and placing it over another element on the fire orb rune. His debugging skill didn't activate. It seemed that it had to be drawn on one piece of paper as a whole. Well, that got me nowhere. Before going to bed, let me copy over all of these modules and try to organize them. Roland looked at his quill and frowned. He really needed a pencil for this kind of work. The quill was sometimes messy and required constant refills of ink. He didn't really have time to buy any scribing materials back at his old city. Everything happened fast, so he only brought over other necessities, like food, water, and clothes. His work continued into the night. Redrawing the single parts was a lot easier without drawing all those magical pathways. He had no idea what they represented yet, but in the future, he would try designing the simplest rune possible, and then start experimenting. Roland believed that if his debugging skill was working with these components, then maybe they were used similar to parts he found on a circuit board. Resistors that were used to control the electric current could be used to control the amount of mana used in a rune. Maybe on the detonation rune, parts like these were used to make the explosion smaller. If he knew which ones to remove, he could create a larger detonation. Transistors that amplified a charge. Maybe if he found something similar to them, he could increase the output on some of these spells. Memory elements could have pre-programmed modules with the actual spell effects in them. If he figured out how those worked, then the path to making his own custom spells would be open to him. There were many possibilities, but they would have to wait till tomorrow, as he was now dead tired. He also needed to check the stores in the city to either find a place to work or try doing it himself. He had a reason to believe that selling his scrolls would be difficult by himself, so he wanted to find a regular job first. He blew out one of the candles that he had brought with himself. Tomorrow, he would finally begin his new life in this place. Chapter 20. Looking for work. Roland woke up the next day earlier than expected. The sound of carriages moving and people talking filled his ears. The residents in this city started the day a bit faster than back in Carwin. They also made a lot more noise. He could hear the sounds of hammers hitting metal even from here. He rose to his feet with one eye glued shut. He was a bit groggy. The fatigue from the week-long train ride didn't go away just yet. He somehow crawled out of his bed and went out of his room. There wasn't really much to do there, and he could just carry his stuff in his spatial bag. He had his breakfast, which tasted bland as before. The common people didn't really have much seasoning besides salt and pepper. The small gnome girl was up and about today. He decided to try not to bump into her again, as she looked easily irritable. He needed to inspect the new city. Besides this inn and the Adventurers Guild, there were other interesting places to see. First, he decided to find himself a general store that sold items for scribes. He needed to get himself some paper or blank scrolls made from monster skin. He wasn't sure which ones were better, but it would probably be easier to draw on paper than rough scrolls. He kept looking around, quite curious about the people living here. He had been in this world for almost 6 years now. The time that he had spent adventuring was already over half a year. The adventurers were a peculiar bunch, but he found them a well-knit group. There were still dangers in this world, though. Bandits and monsters prowled in the night, and you could get yourself a death sentence if you bumped into a person in a high enough position. Luck was on his side, as besides that one encounter, he had managed to fly under the radar. This was probably thanks to the adventurer party he had joined. The three girls were quite cautious in their hunts. He didn't show it back then, but he noticed that they were different from the usual adventurer group. They didn't wander into the deeper parts of the dungeon, even though they should be strong enough. He had reason to believe that they weren't willing to go there with a child like him. He shook his head around, trying to forget about the recent, but now old days. He needed to get some shopping done, and he had reached one of the larger general stores. He entered inside, and could hear a bell ringing the moment he pushed the door open. He could see some people inside looking at the items on display. The first thing he noticed were the long display cases. They had items placed in them with small text which showed the name and the pricing akin to modern-day price tags. There were some bookcases placed at the walls and some decorations in the form of shields and swords at the walls. This was a general item store, so you could find things like potions, scrolls, and even provisions here. "Good day, customer, feel free to look around the store." He heard someone calling out to him. In front behind the display cases stood an older gentleman. He had large glasses on, and was partially balding with some hair on the sides. He was wearing a heavy apron over his regular clothes, with some tools sticking out from the pockets. Roland nodded and moved closer to the display cases. He could see some potions of various grades. They had the same grading system as the runes, ranging from lesser all the way up to legendary. Here he found mostly lesser and common ones, though. Oh, they do have some scrolls here. In one of the display cases, he saw some rolled-up scrolls. This one he was looking at had a mana arrow spell inscribed onto it. He looked at the price and saw that this one went for 1 small silver coin. He wasn't sure if that was a large sum for an item like this, so he tried comparing the price to monster kills. He reasoned that it wouldn't be worthwhile to kill a goblin with this spell scroll unless you were getting a mana stone out of it. If you considered this a life-saving measure, then it wasn't that costly. He looked further and spotted more scrolls that were being sold. The next one in line was a fire arrow spell scroll. This was a direct upgrade from a mana arrow spell, and was tier 2 magic. A person making this scroll had to be a more advanced scribe along with being an elemental fire mage. The cost of this spell was triple what the inferior one cost. Roland was a bit surprised by it only being this much. He was inclined to think that this spell should cost a lot more. It was always best to ask when you had some questions instead of overthinking, so he looked at the store owner and gave his question. "Excuse me, why does this fire arrow spell only cost 3 small silvers when it's a tier 2 spell while this mana arrow spell costs 1 small silver?" The store owner moved a bit closer to look at what his customer was looking at and then gave the answer. "Even though it's a tier 2 spell, it isn't that much more potent. It also depends on the person making these scrolls and materials. If it was a fireball spell, it would cost about 6 small silver per scroll. Also, dear customer, these scrolls get identified by a professional that can distinguish their true attacking value. An archmage could very well create a simple mana arrow spell that would be several times stronger than a fire arrow spell. It all depends on the person making it." The shop owner was quite happy to explain while taking out one of the scrolls and showing them off. These scrolls also had gradings just as the runes. They were a bit different, as the determining factor was not how well they were made, but how much power was injected into them during the creation process. The people made it simple and rated them from lowest to highest, and they were checked by a special device before a price was assigned. "I see, thank you." Roland nodded and wondered how high his grading would be if he wrote down his own mana arrow and mana bolt spell. He had a lot more intelligence and mana than a regular mage, so he should be able to make more powerful spell scrolls. Before asking more questions, Roland went around the store and found the things he was looking for. He found some magic ink and the more crude-looking monster skin scrolls. He was also sure to get himself a pencil and more sketching paper. From what the shop owner said, these were the cheaper options, as the magic paper was made from some difficulty to come by wood. In contrast, monsters were easily hunted down in certain dungeons, and were a good renewable resource. The empty scrolls came in bundles of 10, and they were close to the size of a 5 paper. This meant that they weren't all that big, but considering the spells he was going to write on them weren't that high level, this was enough. Larger spells required larger scrolls, but these were enough for tier 1 and tier 2 spells. 10 blank scrolls cost him 9 small silver, which put them at 9 large copper coins apiece. So, if he managed to sell them all at the price of the mana arrow spell in this shop, he would only be making 1 small silver coin. He probably wouldn't be making any money if he added the price of the magic ink into the mix. He was seriously contemplating getting a job now. If he worked for someone, he wouldn't need to worry about manufacturing costs, and he would be still able to earn experience points while getting paid. "Excuse me, are there any scroll scribing shops nearby?" The shop owner gave Roland the location of the nearest store, but he didn't know if they were recruiting. He bowed respectfully to the man before leaving. The man had been really helpful. His next destination was a place called Exior's Magic Emporium. It was one of the larger magic shops in the city, and was apparently owned by some rich magic user. Roland had no idea what class of mage the person was, but he was loaded. Roland was slightly worried that he wouldn't be able to get a spot in the workforce, mainly due to his lack of elemental affinity. He wasn't sure if he should disclose that he had a more advanced version of the scribe class to people he didn't know either. The mana arrows weren't really a hot commodity from what he could tell. He ended up by a large 3-story building. It had the name that the shop owner mentioned. The sign on it was composed of 2 potions on the side, a scroll in the middle with a staff going through them. It had your standard magic shop feel to it, nothing out of the ordinary. "I guess this is it." The first thing he did was to see if there were any job listings hanging outside the 3-story tall building. He didn't find anything like that, so he decided to step inside. The doors were a bit peculiar as they didn't have any handles, but this mystery was resolved quite fast as they opened by themselves the moment he got there. On the inside it had a similar layout as the general store he visited before. There were display cases with various magical items scattered all over the place. He could buy spell scrolls just as in the previous shop, but they had a lot more variations. He checked the names, and he compared the prices, which came out to be strangely similar. He went through the larger spell scroll section of the shop. There were various spells here, like fireball spells, lightning bolt spells, freezing cones, and various others. He wasn't looking for those though, he was interested in something else. He finally arrived at a smaller section that was further in the back. It was the runic spell scroll section. There were actually few and far between scrolls in this section. They looked a bit dusty, as if no one had picked them up in a while. There wasn't much variation, and they didn't come in bundles like the regular scrolls. They looked more like an exhibit than actual items for purchase. He leaned in closer, interested in what type of spells these were. Runic orb of light spell, runic fire arrow spell, runic aqua ball spell. They were mostly simple lower tier spells. He glanced at the fire arrow one. He could compare the prices of this one to its counterpart. The moment he saw the numbers, he realized why these were not getting sold. It cost 6 or 7 times as much. Who would buy this? There wasn't a spell under the price of a large silver coin, and that was the Orb of Light. The Fire Arrow spell cost 2 large silver coins. This was a large gap to the regular Fire Arrow spell scroll that went for 3 small silver coins. He tried thinking about why these spell scrolls cost so much more than the other ones. There could be a couple of possibilities, but luckily there was a clerk coming his way, so he could just ask like before. It was a cute-looking girl with long ears, and she was of the taller kind, an elf. She was wearing a red robe of some kind, with the same logo that the store had on her chest part. She was quite the beauty with golden hair as most of the elves were. "Hello there, need any help?" The girl smiled. She looked to be in her later teens, but from what Roland knew, she could be well into her 50s. The elves were a race that could live for a very long time. Yes, why do these runic spell scrolls cost so much more than the regular spell scrolls? He was here to ask for a job, but he was also interested in why the runic scrolls were so overpriced. Also why they didn't look like they were selling well. That's simple. These spell scrolls are a lot harder to produce than the ordinary spell scrolls. They also require a runesmith to produce them. Roland didn't actually get describing the regular spells just yet. He did know that it took quite a while to create one of those runic scrolls. He needed close to an hour to produce one, and he was in a rush for time. The runic spell he made was also on the more rudimentary side, so he could only imagine how long a more complex spell would take to scribe down. From the conversation with the elf lady, it became apparent. The spell scrolls cost so much due to it requiring a tier 2 runesmith, and also a lot more time. The runesmiths probably weren't willing to drop the price range due to the time and effort put into their work. There were a couple of those spell scrolls there. He wanted to get them for further research. He could probably upgrade them to the highest grade and get some schematic experience while at it. Before that though, he recalled what he was here for in the first place. Yes, excuse me miss. Is this shop perhaps looking for monoscribes? He didn't want people to know that he was a runic monoscribe just yet, as he didn't know if that would bring any unwanted attention to him. The elf girl looked at him from top to bottom and nodded. Monoscribe? I'll have to ask the manager. I think we are, but she didn't finish the sentence while covering her mouth as if she was holding back from revealing too much information. Just follow me. I'll bring you to the manager. He is always looking for good workers. Till the woman turned around, and he followed after her. They both headed upstairs. The stairs were quite narrow and circular, and there was hardly any space for anyone to walk next to. On the next floor, he saw a corridor leading to a room with the words manager on them. To the sides were other rooms that were closed off. These rooms also had words written on them. One of them had potions on them, another one scrolls and spells written on a plaque. Those were either production rooms or places where they stored those items. Before he could examine his surroundings, the elf girl knocked on the door. They both heard a high-pitched voice answering with a "come in," and so they did. Inside was your usual office with a large desk. On that desk, beside documents, there was a full-blown chemist set with various vials and tubes. There were various colorful liquids going through those tubes. For what reason he did not know. To the sides were shelves filled with some strange ingredients which made Roland think that he entered an alchemist's workshop. "What is it, Ileana? You know that I'm busy." The person that answered wasn't human. He was a person with a smaller frame, and a large head, and his ears were pointy, but not as long as an elf's. He was holding a pipette and dropping some blue liquid into a larger pitcher of green liquid. "Manager, I've brought you a potential worker. I think this boy wants to work as a scribe." The smaller man stopped what he was doing and glanced at Roland with his eyes. He then went right back to what he was doing while speaking. "Just show him the contract. If he signs it, you can test his skills in scribing. Now, leave, I'm busy with my research." The two headed out, and the elf girl just smiled at Roland while shrugging. "Don't mind the manager. He is always buried deep into his work. He is actually an advanced alchemist." Sure, he mentioned some kind of contract." The girl nodded, and they went downstairs, and they entered a smaller back room. Once inside, the elf girl started to rummage through some stacks of paper. She then brought out a large scroll and handed it to him. It looked a bit beat up and dusty. "You just need to sign the magic contract with your signature and insert some mana for it to work." Magic contract? He was interested in what this was, so he started reading through this so-called contract. The more he read, the more his brows started furrowing. When he arrived at the end, he just looked up to the elf with a confused expression. "Why, you want me to sign this?" The elf nodded, as if everything was fine. The contract was a 6-year deal. It stated that he would work for a set price, and would have to scribe a set number of spells each day. There were a few he could choose from, and depending on it, the number could decrease or increase. This wasn't the problematic part though. Contract stated that he wouldn't have the right to sell any spell scrolls outside the shop, even less if it were spells that he had learned during his work here. In short, they would supply him with the knowledge, but he needed to waive any rights to his work for those 6 whole years. Contract was a magical one, so it would be known if he breached it, and he would suffer some type of curse. It might have not looked like such a bad deal. He would have work and would be supplied with crafting materials. The only thing getting impeded would be his freedom. he wouldn't even be able to make spell scrolls outside his work area. So he wouldn't be able to experiment with his runes at all. The 6-year period was also bothering him. He wanted to quickly level up and then get the blacksmith class. If he signed this, he would have to keep working here even when he achieved his goal. You know what? I'll think about it. He decided to leave for now. Maybe the other shops around the city would give him a better deal. He still had a lot of time, and he wasn't low on money, so he wasn't worried, at least not yet.